Okay, we're going to start in about 30 seconds. Very good. That seemed to work quite well. Excellent. So welcome to everybody, and thank you for coming today. I'm Andrea Westall. I'm one of the commissioners on the Independent Commission for Sustainable Equality, which the S&D Group has set up as part of its progressive society work. It's the reason I have a pen in my hand, because I'll be noting everything down that you say. So this conference has a very simple title: Change the European Economic Model for the Many, and with a subtitle, Towards a Partnership for SDGs in Europe. The problem is, though, of course, that that's easy to say, but it is no less than a system change. The Sustainable Development Goals are one way to orient towards this new system, and of course, as the S&D Group, we shouldn't uncritically accept them as they are and just go with all of the goals, but this focus on no one left behind and the interrelationship between the targets creates a very strong framework for the realisation of a progressive society. And it is important to recognise that there were some very hard fights to include some of the SDGs. For example, SDG 10 on inequality nearly didn't make it. And if you think how important that is, then I think you can realise what the impact of this will be. So we have 3.5 hours, now slightly less, to address these challenges. For that reason, the speakers are only going to speak for about 5 minutes. I luckily have one of these here, so if anybody hears this sound, that will be the end of speaking. So we need to have time so that all of you can comment on the ideas that you're going to hear today. And please be very succinct when you speak. We want to hear from everybody. So some of you were here at the meeting in March, where it was about building alliances to create this new model of development for Europe. 6 months on, we're now concerned with practical ways forward. So the results of today are going to feed into ongoing work around transforming EU economic governance by the S&D Group, as well as contribute to the work of the Commission on Sustainable Equality, which will be producing its final recommendations towards the end of the year, from mid-autumn. Because we're all going to be working extremely hard for the next few hours, you're all at the end of the event invited to share cocktails and food, and when you leave the room and you turn left, if you keep going down, so just opposite where the television rooms are, you will find apparently cocktails and refreshments there, but you aren't allowed to obviously leave until we're finished. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Udo Bullmann, who is president of the S&D Group, to provide, I'm sure, a very inspirational start to today. Udo.
Thanks so much for your nice words, and welcome all participants, welcome all friends and colleagues. I'm ready to take the first 15 minutes and then to pass on, so we are pretty in time, I can reassure you. No, I'm kidding. Of course. Some of you have been here when we started at the 8th of March with this inspiring exercise of progressive society. We always had two ideas at the same time. First of all, our parliamentary work needs a renovation. Because if we have decided to come forward with a new approach, and we realized it's impossible to talk about the economy if you don't talk about the environment. But it's also impossible to talk about the environment if you do not talk about the social implication. And once you have talked about economics, environment, and social implication, then you are talking about social justice, about distribution of quality jobs, and the perspectives for the youth. This is all one approach. This was our idea, to start with a holistic social democratic narrative and to check on whatever we are doing in whatever committee, whether that fits with our overall approach of where to go to. Radical change in our daily work on legislative files. But on the other hand, we knew exactly that this is only functioning well if we transcend the boundaries of parliamentary work, if we have friends in the civic community, friends in the academic life, friends in the citizens' initiative, friends in the trade unions, the youth initiatives, the women initiative, that understand what we want, but they also have to speak to us about their ideas, because what we are talking about is not a top-down, it is a bottom-up exercise. We would like to reframe politics to sustainable goals, to preserving the planet, to a just transformation, but this is not only the goal of policies to achieve sustainability. Sustainability is also a methodology that politics is not only prepared and implemented by experts or by politicians. It is the issue of all of us. Insofar we are talking about new political goals. We are talking about new ideas of how to communicate and to reconnect with the people on the ground, but we are decisively also talking about empowerment of people. Empowerment of people is crucial for us because we can overcome the huge amount of cleavages, the huge amount of transformational challenges only by the empowerment of people. People do have to say, and people should have to say. Today you see Europe in a huge danger from enemies from the outside, those who do not like civic freedom, Moscow and elsewhere fight us. Those who do not like the re-regulation of unregulated economies, Washington and elsewhere, do not like us, and rightly they try to fight us. We also have internal enemies who echo these dangers and who try to undermine democratic sovereignty in Europe. We are aware of that, but the only way out, the only way ahead is not business as usual. The only way ahead is radical change, internally as well as externally, and courage. And this exercise today is hopefully a courageous one, is hopefully a useful one, is hopefully a communicative one. I thank very much you for your participation on behalf of the S&D Group and all vice presidents and the Bureau. I thank you very much, experts and people very, very knowledgeable today, exciting discussants today who will inspire us, all of you, and we will listen to you. And of course, I may thank our excellent staff pushing forward for this sustainability agenda. Without those, we couldn't achieve anything. Thanks so much. I'm looking forward to listening to you.
Udo, thank you very much. And I think that set the challenge for the speakers. And our first speaker is Cristina Galac, who's the High Commissioner for Agenda 2030 in the Spanish government. And apparently she's going to tell us how we need to do it.
Thank you very much, dear friends, dear colleagues. Thank you, Udo, for your introductory works and you for the challenge you have to moderate this interesting and important debate. Well, we heard a couple of words already in the introduction. We talk about radical change, and we talk about business as usual, not possible. We heard about sustainability being a methodology. Well, those are key words that the Spanish government, when it assumed the responsibilities of leading the country at the beginning of June, truly interiorized and took a number of decisions to show how the framework for the political transformation, the economic transformation, and the environmental transformation and social transformation that was needed was going to be the Agenda 2030. And this was formalized by a decision of our Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, to create a new office, very small, which is the High Commissioner for the implementation of the Agenda 2030. And to place that office under him. And he asked me a few days after whether I was going to be willing to join the team and to be in charge of that office. And having served at the United Nations as a UN senior official when the Sustainable Development Agenda was adopted, and here are some colleagues that we were together. Having served for many years in the European Union as a senior official, having also served at Nato, and being myself a committed feminist, I couldn't say no to that responsibility that I was asking to be leading, because friends, colleagues, the Agenda 2030 is the best way to manage all the difficult issues, inconsistencies, challenges that the globalization has brought to us in the environment area, in social area, in economic area. So I said to the Prime Minister, yes. And since that moment, since June, a number of key decisions added to the fact of creating the High Commissioner's office and appointing myself and a very, very small team. For example, the government presented a plan, the national plan, to the United Nations in the regular reviews that take place, which had been prepared for a number of months, but in 2-3 weeks it was enlarged, it was deepened, it went much beyond the ambitions that had been settled, because we truly want to make Spain as a leading ground on the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda. A number of other decisions had been done. The appointment of a minister for gender equality, decisions on engaging in drafting a law on energy transformation, energy transition, the decisions in relation to how to address challenges, key challenges such as migration. So I was tasked to do basically 3 things. One is to set up a mobilization in all the layers of the administration, government, regional, municipalities, in the civil society. We have extremely committed organizations related to social issues, extremely committed organizations working for a different perspective of development aid, work with the private sector to embed the Agenda 2030 perspective in their works, in their planning, to be truly transformational. This is a major outreach that has to go to the azimuth, bottom up, top down, presenting a new way of doing things and ensuring that we land the agenda in specific actions, that cities are mobilized, and when they act on transportation, they have the perspective of the agenda. That the universities, when they commit research, they have the perspective of the agenda. That when we talk with the private sector, we tell them, unless you produce differently, your companies will be redundant in a number of years. And telling our people that we are the last generation that we can act on climate, and the first generation we can prepare for a planet without extreme poverty. So I'm with my team, with the government support, with the engagement of all the ministries, the administrations, we are trying to land this agenda in such a way that things happen into the right direction. And I'll just give you an example of how we lead and also we act. 2 weeks ago, it was August, Saturday, well, the government met all the ministers to have a retreat on how to embrace the agenda from the ministry level to the specific political actions and decisions on a Saturday afternoon. That's quite interesting to see the type of leadership that we want to bring to the transformations. Second thing I am asked to do, and I think it's necessary. Yes, we have this ambition. Yes, we have dissected and we are dissecting the actors that have to bring the agenda to the implementation, but we need governance. We need to ensure that this office of the High Commissioner is there to stay. The agenda is until 2030, and governments, you know better than anybody else, and particularly you being in politics, have to leave traces, and important traces for the good. So our ambition is our office to stay, to remain. So we are working on how to ensure that we lock it through the creation of a high-level group with all the ministries led by the Vice President of the government. In addition, we want to mobilize the key actors of the civil society because we know that this transformation has to be shared by everybody. So we are in the process of looking at the creation of a strong advisory council for the sustainable development. And then we have to be very practical. And unless we ground it into actions which are measurable, and then across the years, along the years, we see the changes that the decision produce, we are not going to be able to reach to the point of 2030 being where we want to do. So we have committed ourselves to the work through the indicators that both the United Nations has given us, because the UN has given us 242 indicators, but the ones that the European institutions, Eurostat, has given us to ensure that we do on a regular basis an exam of where we are. We look for the gaps and we ensure that our policies are coherent with addressing those gaps. So quite challenging. Quite daunting task, but I definitely, Spain wants to be a key example and a key leader, both the government with the rest of the administrations at the national level in the European Union. That's why your role here in the institutions is critical, and as well at the international level in the United Nations. And we want to start this mobilization across the European Union to ensure that the agenda is fulfilled with the results that we all expect. Thank you very much.
Christina, thank you. I think it's interesting that a country has really put the SDGs at the centre. In the UK, we don't even talk about them, except interestingly in Wales, there's an Office for Future Generations, which is doing something similar but has no power. So it's starting. So there are other examples around, but it's about that power and that commitment that we're seeing there. So the next speaker, Pavonch Beres, who's the Socialist Econ Coordinator, and she's written, among other things, about the Eurozone budget, and the challenge to Pavonch is how this kind of approach can be translated to the EU level.
Thank you for the proposal to answer to the challenge. I don't commit myself to answer to the challenge. No, maybe you read the paper these days and you heard the ongoing debate in a government in a country I believe I know quite well, And the debate was, is there a Ministre d'État in charge of ESG, given the tools to fulfill what he has been promised would be his portfolio? And obviously the debate that was open with this event is clearly that if you are consistent with such a portfolio, it is not just some light touch approach that can be the answer. And this is really an earthquake in terms of governance if you're going to be consistent with implementing ESG criteria. So as socialists, or even as social democrats or as Democrats, it allows us to be more than blunt. Because I think here everybody is convinced that among the few mistakes we did as social democrats since some years is some kind of inconsistency when choosing the tools, which is the topic of this round table, to implement the goal we had fixed. And I'm just going to, en passant, mention 3 of them. If I recall well, I think Laszlo is here somewhere in the room. Huh? I've seen him, no? Yes. We fighted in the beginning of last mandate in the EU 2020 strategy, and wow, we had won a wonderful target. That was marvelous. That was fight against poverty. Don't ask me to recall the figure because it would be a shame. And then here we are. The main task for this group is now to make sure some people sometimes discuss inequality. This is the first example I want to take. The second one is, of course, ESG. I have to admit that if I look at the balance sheet of this commission, it's going to be quite poor, frankly. It's going to be quite poor. Except, among the things I would rescue is this Ashleg working, the expert group, and the work they've been doing on sustainable finance. But now it's up to us to translate it. And for this, we all know we need to be courageous. This means, for example, in the beginning of the mandate, we knew there might be a question about investment. So, Kathleen, do you remember what happened at that time? Both of us, we were fighting to say, okay, we're going to have an investment strategy, but we need to have 20% for sustainable development projects. We were killed. And then the next time the Commission, things are sometimes moving. Huh? Next time the Commission came up with their new proposal, and they had included this proposal in it. We still had to fight a bit to make sure it was there, but now it's there. Just because the market had realized that they needed to go there, so it was not so difficult to fulfill the target. So this means we should not be shy to be blunt, and here I'm coming. We are all discussing, or at least you were kind enough to recall that I think this has been my track record since the first day I was in this house fighting over a Eurozone budget. This is not the topic for today. But on top of this, I think if I want to be consistent with our agenda this afternoon, I have to say that the Growth and Stability Pact, as it stands, does not allow to fulfill long-term investment strategy and sustainable goal and fight against inequality. I mean, we can't say the contrary. Huh? So it's not only about having flexibility in the Growth and Stability Pact. It is because we are social democrats, so we've been trying to accommodate many processes. And for example, we accepted the Lisbon strategy. We were going to have this famous MOC. That was marvelous. Open, it's not MOC in English, open method of coordination. And now we know it didn't work. Member states are even realizing that it doesn't work in the world of economic policy. So in the world of economic policy, to implement the Growth and Stability Pact, they want there to have strong rule, and they admit that simple coordination doesn't work. But of course, this strong rules, they don't want it to have it in the field we want and in the direction we want to go. So let's take them by the words. They want to have strong rules to implement their strategy, which is the criteria of the Growth and Stability Pact. We want to have strong rules to implement the fight against inequality and the implementation of ESGs. Let's have the debate. But this is not a small adjustment debate. Huh? It is a straightforward debate. Now, of course, I'm told I have this little paper, terrible paper, on the podium that is coming to me. So I will just conclude by saying that if, of course, you challenge the Growth and Stability Pact, you will have to challenge the European semester. But frankly, the European semester is something to accompany the Growth and Stability Pact in a soft implementation that doesn't take into account the reality of what's happening in the member state, doesn't take into account, for example, something maybe we have rediscovered with this crisis or during this mandate, that fiscal policy do have multiplicator effect. And if we don't use this in favor of our strategy, long-term investment strategy, I think we cannot achieve it. Last point. I know it's a bridge to the second roundtable, but I want to say it because as socialist, I have tested in my working group as coordinator with people in econ. And what do they tell me when I tell you, well, we need to go for ESG and blah, blah, blah? Okay. But when I go to my voters, they know that if we close coal, mine and so on, they will lose their job. So if we want to be here on this, we need first to address not only, sorry to burden the work, but not only to say we will challenge the inequality, but also we will allow people to move, to transit from the current situation to the next one. And they will not be the one to pay for the ecological transition. And I think this is really one of our main messages that we should convey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pavanche. And that challenge about the transition and the distribution aspects of that is something very much that does need to be factored in. I was talking just before about circular economy, where there it seems to be happening in silo without thought to what some of these things could come out. So that needs to be also factored in. We'll now move to Peter Schmidt, who's President of the European Economic Social Committee's Sustainable Development Observatory, to provide us with even more ways forward.
Thank you very much, Andrea. I was asked to use the left micro, so I don't know why the left here. So perhaps I'm in the right room. I'm Peter Schmidt. I'm president of the SDO, of the Sustainable Development Observatory of the EC. For those who are not so familiar with the ESC, we are the organized European civil society, and we are an advisory body for the Parliament, for the Commission, for the Council. And as I can imagine, almost everybody knows the ESC here in the room. So, but this unfortunately not. We are composed in three groups: the employers, the workers, and the various interests. These are consumer organizations and so on. I'm a trade unionist. I come from the group 2. So this is a challenge for me to keep the time in 5 minutes. So you see, I have the whole list, but I will keep and try to keep in time. So I want to start with an issue, a little bit following that what Pavanche said in the end. For me and for us, it's clear we need at first. I know it's a little bit an illusion, but I want to be provocative. We need another economic model. As long as we have this economic model, we will not come to an implementation of the SDGs. Why? because of the race to the bottom, because of the wrong definition of competitiveness. So we have a definition of competitiveness only, and the race to the bottom only to make everything cheap and to exploit the environment, to exploit the people. And that's a big problem what we have. So that's why when we talk about the implementation of SDGs, we always have to stress and to discuss the economic model, because that's the main reason why we are in the situation where we are. So when it comes to the discussion, who is taking the leadership, then we hear all over the world. We had, now he's gone, but we met us in New York. The whole world is telling us Europe has the leadership in the implementation of the SDGs. Sorry to say that. I can't see this. We have eaten our resources in some of the member states in the end of April. In the end of April. We can't say that we are the leaders in implementing the SDGs. So that's why I'm very critical, and I say in all the questions what you gave us, it must be the implementation of SDGs a part of the European semester. Yes. Must be this a part of governance? Yes, of course. Otherwise, we are not able to implement the SDGs. It is crucial to do that. The question is how to come to that. We are in a hostile environment, not here in the room, but we are in a hostile environment here in Brussels. I'm in the ESC now for 4 years. So I'm a trade unionist. I come from the shop floor. I was in charge of advising people, advising works councils in defending their rights. I was totally surprised that the result of the crisis what we have in Europe is not really in the heads of the people making policy here in Brussels. They go this neoliberal way. They don't make any change. So that's why we have to stress this issue. So when we agree that we say implementing SDGs, let's say along that what business is usual, it does not work. It does not work. So that's why we have to stress all the people in that. So that means we have to define targets. We don't have targets. We do not have targets in Europe in implementing the SDGs. How we measure it, when we don't have targets, we can't say, do we have a success or not? So this is a step what we have to do. We here can do that to address it to the policymaker. Second thing is, I said I am trade unionist, and I don't speak with my voters, so because I'm not elected, but I speak with the people on the shop floor. Nobody in the factories in Europe, no worker, almost no worker, knows anything about SDGs. They don't have any clue what is it. So, and we have to find a way how we communicate with the people, with the real people, not with the people here living in this Brussels bubble or in the New York bubble or in the Genevan bubble. We have to find a way how we can translate these SDGs into the real life of the people. Otherwise, they don't follow us. We have to do that. This is our job. This is the job of the organized civil society. This is the job of the parties. This is the job of the parliament. This is the job of the NGOs. Third thing, I hope I'm still in time. I see I have 10 minutes. Okay. So third thing is it's a very dangerous thing. Third thing is traditionally the SDGs are coming from the green side. Okay, that's the historical development, the movement. We must be aware, without any social development in Europe, people are not following our agenda. This is the first thing what you said. I fully agree, the fight against inequality. What does it mean? It means, to give you an example, we discussed today an opinion in our ESC, two opinions. The one is the monitoring of the SDGs. The other one is to tackle the unfair trading practices in the food supply chain. I come from the food side. To give you there an example, what we discussed. the big multinationals in the food companies have raised their margin, the profit rate, to 20% from the turnover. From the turnover. We discuss here in Europe, in Brussels, whether the farmers get 30 cents from their liter of milk what they produce. That's absolutely ridiculous. And we accept this development. We accept it that they can say, we want to have 20% of the turnover. And this is not sustainable. It doesn't fit to sustainability. It doesn't fit to the SDGs. And we have to address it. I call everybody in the institutions to address this and to stress the people to say, no, we don't accept this race to the bottom.
Peter, thank you. And I think that point about sort of making sure that the targets themselves are relevant and strong enough is something that the S&D group can really push, because it isn't, like we're saying, about just taking what's there and implementing it. It's making it real so that it actually will address the challenges that we all have. Now move on to Marianne Kettunen, who is Principal Policy Analyst and Lead of Global Challenges and SDGs for the Institute for European Environmental Policy.
Thank you.
Marianne.
I have prepared a few slides, so I'm going to move them here. Just use the arrow. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. So, I think that last year's report from UNEP, UN Environment, hit the nail on the head when it said that sustainable development goals are disruptive. They imply a radical departure from business as usual. But what I'd like to add to that is that, yes, indeed disruptive, but in the best of possible ways. So in the kind of way that will enable us to achieve the regime shift that we basically need, and we've been talking about with the earlier panelist members as well. So that's the starting point, to embrace the disruptiveness of it all. So to explore that, I've picked up a few of the questions that were put forward to the panel members. And I'm going to be looking at them from the perspective of policy framework delivery in the European context. So first question I picked up, do EU sectoral policies require a rethink? We as IEP, we would say yes, absolutely indeed. So as we've already heard, implications of the EU SDG process has so far focused on the technical aspects of the implementation. So for example, developing the indicator framework. But it hasn't really ensured the buy-in and the sectoral mainstreaming at the political level. So as we heard, we don't have concrete sectoral political priorities, targets, and actions in place. That is a problem for the delivery. We need those tools. Also, we are not, or can't at the moment be entirely sure whether our policies, sectoral policies, are SDG compatible across all the SDGs in place. So the Commission communication so far that we have, it looks at the unique and special way that the different sectoral policies kind of contribute to different SDGs. But it doesn't do it very systematically. It doesn't look at the compatibility. And also, as I said, it doesn't look, for example, how the SDGs might be contributing or perhaps not even not contributing to delivery policies to deliver SDGs. To understand what I'm talking about, you can simply ask yourself the question, are you sure that the CAP, so European Agricultural Policy, for example, delivers for water and biodiversity? I leave you with that question. Another thing we don't quite know at the moment is that when we implement European policies internally, what will be their external impact? And again, if you want to know what I'm trying to get at with this question, ask yourself, right, so what are the SDG implications of implementing the EU circular policy package, circular economy policy package, outside EU in the third countries? Can you answer this question? If not, I think we have an issue with the tools and information we have. So I think we need a rethink in terms of sectoral policies and the tools we have to deliver SDGs with them. Another question, does the EU SDG monitoring framework, already referred to, require further development? Again, I would say yes, it does. The framework as it is now, it has its merits. is relatively robust in a number of ways. But as we've heard, because we don't have set particularly quantitative policy goals for sectoral policies, it's very difficult to monitor them. So therefore, the framework doesn't do that in terms of delivery towards a goal. It can look at trends. It can say that we're on the right track. But being on the right track doesn't mean that where we are at the moment in terms of delivering SDGs is satisfactory. So we can't really say that. We can say we're on the right track, but that's all, because we don't have the endpoint against which to match ourselves with. Also, there's an issue with the SDG monitoring governance between different governance levels. So UN, EU, and member states. So at the moment, the EU indicator set is aligned as far as possible with the global indicators. So currently, there are 55 out of 100 indicators which are similar. So then we look at the member state level, the voluntary national reports that member states use to report to the UN process. They all report SDGs on SDGs slightly different ways. And also, generally, they cover slightly different issues than at the EU level. So therefore, it's not possible to develop a coherent and comparative view and picture between member states, EU, and also the global level. And I'd love to hear, for example, how Spain is going to tackle with this, and what kind of plans you have to perhaps try to be more coherent because you're looking at all the indicators. So, of course, the question then comes, what to do about it? And I've listed a few ideas that we come up with to try to improve the situation. So firstly, of course, integrate SDGs delivery into policy sectors. So identify priorities across the EU sectoral policies, agree on a framework how to implement and deliver them, and priorities that will be then adopted by the member states. We all know that financing is important to implement any kind of policy, any kind of goal. So of course, we therefore need to ensure that there's funding for SDG delivery. And that brings us to think about the proposed framework for EU financing. So is it currently SDG applicable? And we think it actually isn't. It doesn't explicitly operationalize the SDGs. It mentions them, but not. Perfect. And then we need to monitor the delivery, not the progress. We need to complement the indicator set as well. And we also need to stop monitoring in silos. So trying to look at better how one sectoral policy can deliver for several SDGs at the same time. And based on that, it would be great if we could design an evidence-based SDG implementation strategy with some elements listed here, building on the above. And I'm going to leave them here, perhaps to read and to circulate later on, because I don't want to exceed my time. And we can go back to that in a discussion, perhaps. But with that, I thank you.
Marianne, that was great, and I presume that these slides will be made available after the event. I'm looking, yes, they will be distributed to everyone, because this, I think, was a really useful summary of ways forward. And just so let's not forget the external impact. I was at a conference recently where cotton was discussed. If we move to a sustainable polymer rather than cotton, think about where cotton is grown at the moment. There are some really, really tough areas, and if they go, that's going to make them even more problematic. So it's very important to think about all those dimensions. So Kathleen Van Bremt, who is one of the 3 vice presidents of the S&D group in charge specifically of the Progressive Society Initiative, has the unenviable task of bringing this together to see what this all means.
Thank you so much, and thank you all the previous speakers. I've listened very carefully, and I will try to sort of bring that back to what should be the task here in our political group at the European level. But moving beyond that, I think, is very, very important. Let me first say, how do we summarize the task ahead of us when we look to the SDGs? And it's the word all of you in your way used, is that we need a radically different other model of development. And then we need to define what will we do with it? What should we do with it? Well, I think there are 2 main tasks. The first is equal access and opportunities for all Europeans, and if possible, we also have a very important task outside of the European Union, to lead a good life, combined with, of course, elimination of the excessive burden on our ecosystem. The two of them are equally important and they should be combined together. And to make that happen, we need to radically change the way we eat, we live, also our housing, our energy system, our transport system, and others, but that might be the crucial ones. And if we look at that, what do we need? We need technological change. We need technology to make that happen. And the good news is that that is possible. We know that by now, and we still need a lot of new technologies. We need to put a lot of efforts and energy in that. But for most of the issues, we know how to do that. What is the way forward? And in that sense, here in the European Parliament, for instance, a very good example is the Commission. Sometimes we need to say something good about the Commission, Pervenche. They took up the energy issue, in a sense, an energy union, work on that, and it went in the right direction. Although you can ask yourself, did we do the both in an equal way? Access to good life for everybody. Make sure that that is accessible for everybody. But we made a move, and that is going quite in the good direction. But it's absolutely not good enough for the people who are very much into, for instance, the climate issues. When you look to ETS and energy efficiency, we invented, some years ago, we invented the ETS system to make sure that we have a carbon pricing. That is really an old way, old market-driven way of trying to deal with that. We went along with that because we didn't have any other opportunities. But as socialists and democrats, as social democrats, as socialists, we shouldn't have done that because we see it doesn't make any difference. Well, it makes a little difference, but it's not a game changer. And to make these game changers, we need governance. I just want to underline that so much because it's so important, because Peter talked about hostile environment and hostile environment. It's also there. It's not easy today to say we need more and good governance, because what we hear is we need a state and governments to retrieve. We need Europe to retrieve. And it's not about more, it's about making good governance. And I don't have to repeat everything, all you have said, because you all in your way gave good examples. I am so happy that we now have the Spanish example of how good governance can be put in place. How a government, and imagine yourself, I said that to Christina before, how do you do that? Pedro Sanchez came into government and 2-3 weeks later, there was a plan. Because they already took that up into the DNA of what they believed in. And then you have to make it happen. Pervenche mentioned, extremely important, we have to keep working on that, and for us it should be crucial for the next Commission. No more longer a European semester as we know it, an economic growth pact. It should be completely only based on the Sustainable Development Goals. And then we need to work on that. How do we do that? 30 seconds. Oh my God.
1 minute, 30 seconds.
Okay, 1 minute 30, 1 minute 30 seconds. Okay. So the governance is extremely important and key. I'm working with a lot of people also on the governments here in the European Parliament for the next term, because that will be important as well. I just want to make one extra, an extra dimension, not to discuss today, because I think it will bring us too far. But I've learned that there's also a cultural dimension of what we are doing here. In the sense, we will not achieve if we only have good technologies and the technological solutions and good governance. We need to change the minds of the people in a cultural way. Peter said, you're a unionist, you're from the trade unions. And trade unions are one of the very, very dear partners of our group. But today, I'll give you just one example. We are working on the CO2 of cars. Extremely important, and make sure that we have the transport system of the future. I see you laughing. At the same time, today, it's the unions, the trade unions, that are telling us, but we're for sustainability. But no, not for the cars, because, you know, we have a lot of car manufacturers. I'm making it really black and white. But what I want to say is, we need to take everybody along, of course, in a just transition. So we need cultural change as well. So it's not only good governance, good technologies, but also make the change in our minds and the minds of our people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. And we started a bit late, so we've got about 10 minutes for questions, but not really questions, actually. I think try to build on what you've heard and think about some sort of, very practical, concrete ways forward so that we can start to really put some meat behind this. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Arne Leeds. I'm a member of the German group, and very practical. We brought up a topic on textile supply chains as a best practice, because we have some countries who take this up very seriously. You have the Netherlands with a textile initiative, you have the Germans, you have the Danish, you have the Swedish, and they supply chain the whole way through. You look at sustainable development goals in the countries where things are produced. The SDGs on consumption is a crucial part for the European Union on supply chains. And on textile, you target a great topic. Jolene today said we have to be clear on some content. The Greens take and target now plastic. So let's target supply chains and something positive. Textile is a positive thing. Public procurement goes down to the town hall. We have Fashion Evolution worldwide in Europe. You can all become patrons of Fashion Evolution and bring the supply chain down to your policemen, to your hospitals, to your public procurement in the town halls for the workers there, but also the general understanding of the public and working with business and best practices on SDGs, which are going on water, on child labor, on decent work, on consumption, on energy. You can have that all in there. And we are going to do very practical fashion show from the S&D group in November, where we tell on SDGs how you can do this on fashion and what does it mean. And so this is something which is coming up for our group, and very happy that this has been supported by the group.
Thank you very much. I'm going to collect a few more and just say on that one, I think it's just added another dimension to this, which is cutting through sectors, and the governance for that allows you to bring the culture in with the economics and makes that bigger change. So that's a really good point. There's a comment over here first.
So my name is Maria Rena. I'm working in the INTA committee, MEP, and I totally agree with what Pervenche said, that as socialists we accept some soft law when it comes to social agreements, but we accept hard law when it comes to European semester and everything is linked to the investment. And she said that we were a little bit naive in this way, and perhaps for the future we have to be a little bit more strong on this. But I must say that we are just doing exactly the same in the trade agreements. We are signing and we are voting now, for the moment now. We will have in a few weeks here in the European Parliament a trade agreement on Japan. And we will vote as S&D in a majority in favor of this trade agreement without having strong law on TSD chapter, without having any sanctions on TSD chapters. So I think that we have been naive in the past, and we continue to be naive, even if we have all these experts telling us, please don't do this in this way. And we are really a minority in this group to say that we have to change. Minority perhaps because we are not courageous on this, perhaps because we don't have the trade unions with us, perhaps because we have too light NGOs with us. So we have to fight together. So I just ask to everybody to have all this information and perhaps to be a little bit more courageous to change the way we are dealing and to change the way we are just voting on this kind of agreements. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's going to make Brexit interesting if we include this as well. Yes, a comment over there.
Yeah, there are NGOs, Maria, you know it, and one of them is Solidar, Konja Reuter from Solidar. Just 2-3 short remarks. It has to do very much with policy coherence, but it has also to do with urgency. And I think the planet is not waiting, and it is all this where we come back to the famous debate. Shall we first negotiate transitions and then the planet comes back, or how do we deal this? And I think, in fact, if we speak on game changers, yes, the game changer, the number one, is the question of governance. And yes, we cannot continue with Europe 2020 which has been buried without having a funeral service, because it was never declared at end. And we have a European semester which is still based on the stupidity of the Stability and Growth Pact, preventing us from any investment and so on. And Pervenche said it. So how to deal it and how to come back with it. First of all, I think it's very important what has been said also by Kathleen and others, the cultural dimension. We do not escape from the question of raising awareness. And the raising awareness has to be at every level on education, in the formal, non-formal and informal education, and also awareness raising, dear Peter, in the trade union movement and at every shop, because the question of the consequences of a consumption and of a growth and economic model, we know about it, but even us, we are not always very credible in our daily life to say we are for change, because we are also weak human beings. The question then is, how do we organize the transition? And I think this is sector by sector. I think what you are doing, Arne, it's not because we are friends and I admire the way and the enthusiasm you bring into it on the fashion side, but give examples. When you break it down and make it concrete, people can follow. For sure, those who you want to close the coal mines in Eastern Germany, they are not interested by fashion, they are interested by job. But the question is, where is the cat coming back? And the cat is coming back from the moment being where we need to have another discourse and much more radical, Maria, I agree with you, not only on some trade agreements, but on the matter of investment. It is not nice just to say, dear Commission President, and he will make a nice speech, which will be disappointing next Wednesday, where are the SDGs? It is to say, where is the real investment? And I remember also we had these debates when he came with social investment and said, oh no, this is later. No, but social investment and investment for transition, I think this should be the radical call, and build a program around this, because then we can come back to the question how to turn it on the crucial question, which is which economic model, which growth model is there necessity for growth, how far can we go, and what about competitiveness?
Thank you. Any comments from the panel just to finish off the, I'm afraid, unfortunately, because we have to move on to the next session. Any comments there? Can you wait till the next one? Is that all right? Thank you.
Hi, I have a quick comment regarding the textile supply idea, because examples are always good, and if there is a sector that would like to show the way, brilliant. And the questions I would then like to ask in a future process is, A, what would you therefore need from the European circular economy regime to be able to be sustainable and deliver that? So it'd be really interesting to hear that and also feed that into the process. And while at it, looking at the external impacts of the textile industry in Europe, and that, what global impacts it might have, and therefore how then those can be addressed.
Just a very quick comment. Yes, I agree with you that if we look at the huge cosmological challenge, it's immense, and we tend to say, oh my God, we are not going to make it. But the position that at least the Spanish government took was one that let's dissect and find the policies that are going to be truly transformational and are going to be, in a way, moving us along all the SDGs. And I'm going to cite a few of them, because if we look it through policies and less through specific SDGs, we will find the mobilization from the top at legislative level, and from the bottom, as you mentioned, wonderful actions from cities, from regional governments, etc., which in some cases they are advanced than the central governments. This is a little bit our experience. When we were putting together the plan, we realized that there were a few regions that have done much more work in landing the SDGs that ever thought at central level. Very quickly, for example, for us, the policies which are a priority and are going to be moving us to the successful implementation are fight against poverty, exclusion, and in favor of equality. Equal opportunities. We have a strategic plan for equal opportunities. In the implementation of the urban agenda, which we know it comes from the UN, but it lands in the cities. We are planning for climate transition and energy transition law. Everything which relates to research and technology. Your words as the driving force that's going to make us be successful is definitely research and technology. Open government. open government is critical. It's such in essence, what we have to do, we have to bring the prism of open government, which is goes beyond transparency. And then we are going to, at least in the Spanish level, to plan for a social economy strategy, 2020, which is already in place, but we are going to adapt it. So I think those are the platforms that are going to help us achieve the results.
Fantastic, Christina. And just to say, I know that people want to ask questions. There'll be opportunities throughout the rest of the day, but please also make sure that this isn't just the end of the conversation. There's, please respond through the website to the ongoing discussions, and you'll have lots of reflections after the event. So jot everything down and make sure that you don't sort of leave any of the key points. I'd like to say thank you again to this panel for really getting us off to a fantastic start with lots to think about. Thank you. Just so we're going to be starting in again in 30 seconds, so we'll be having a break after this next session for 10 minutes. So please don't all disappear from the room. Have we got everybody? Yes, we do. Thank you. English 2. Okay. Okay, so we're ready now to start the second session. And the first session was about looking at the EU level, at governance, but we started to drill down into sectors and into other areas. What we're now going to do is to move on to local and regional responses to sustainable development, and then the role of the EU and national governments in supporting those local and regional responses. For example, this gets extremely concrete in what this means for the future of cohesion policy, something that we as on the Commission have been devoting a huge amount of time, because the inequalities between areas is... Could everybody please be quiet so that we can give attention to the speakers? Thanks. So the cohesion policy, I think, is something where there does need to be a lot of attention. We know it hasn't worked. We know that there are high and rising inequalities between areas, or the common agricultural policy and some of the effects that can have. So our first speaker will be Eric Ondre, who is the Vice President, again, of the S&D Group, also in charge of Progressive Society, who has got a specific focus on these areas. Eric.
Oui, merci.
Yes, thank you. So, very briefly, indeed, I think what's happening is that there's a big paradox at the moment. We have SDGs which were adopted in 2015, and we're working on a MFF calendar which goes from 2021 to 27. And obviously the SDGs, as we saw from the first round table, are supposed to work across the board through all the European institutions, and yet this isn't working because there's a global attitude, and yet at the same time there is a fashion of working in silos, and some people are working for cohesion, for structural funds, ERDF and so on, and all the other programs. So there is a bit of a dichotomy there, trying to get everybody to work to the same goals and trying to marry up the procedure, which is top-down, and the bottom-up procedure of the local and regional levels. So we're in that logic in the Parliament where everybody's working on reports with tight deadlines, which run counter to the SDGs, because the SDGs is 2030, the MFF is 2021 to 27, so it's not compatible. So it would be very useful, I think, to bring in Parliament some thinking about whether we should bring these things in line, so that we could ask all our rapporteurs and co-rapporteurs to get together and talk about what they're all doing, because we're working in silos in ignorance of what other people are doing, we tend to lose sight of where we're trying to get politically. Now, what does this mean for the local level? Well, this is my point of view, I would say regional level rather. It means that the procedures clash with the processes, and that happens in the local and regional level. The only European program which allows all the local and regional levels to participate is the LEADER initiative. That's the only one. Now, the LEADER initiative depends on the rural development programs and the CAP, and in this budgetary logic, this is going to be cut by 27%. So this means that there's a paradox between the commendable SDGs and the realities of local and regional levels. And we, as S&D, have to worry about that, because this is about the citizenship, and there's a political crisis, and I think it's our responsibility not to look so much at the amount of money available, but to look at what we want to achieve at local and regional level and how much funding goes to that level. And I think it's important that as we try and build what we're trying to do in the Parliament, all stakeholders need to be aware that this is part of a process, and it goes from the very local, the town council, the regions as well, and right up to global level and international trade agreements. So I think we have to keep sight of where we're trying to go politically with our public policy. And I think that the approach here is to raise the goal before you look at the funding for the goal. And that is a very valid approach.
Eric, thank you very much. Sorry, I was a bit delayed because I was contemplating what Eric was saying, and I come from a coastal area in the UK, and it has to be said that there, one of the reasons for Brexit was because none of these issues are reaching out to those places, and it's not just about putting the money in at all. It's a huge shift there. Our next speaker is Frédéric Vallier, who's the Secretary General of the Council of European Municipalities and Regions, and member, which is extremely important for today as well, of the SDG multi-stakeholder platform, which is a way of bringing together a lot of the different stakeholders in order to contribute to what the EU can be doing. Frédéric.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Yes, the CMR has been working right from the beginning in discussions with the United Nations on setting up the SDGs and implementing them at local level. And that's why we took part in the debate in the United Nations and at European level, and we were invited to represent the local and regional government levels in the various debates about the agenda and the SDGs and the European level in the high-level platform chaired by a social democrat, Mr. Timmermans. And I have to say that, well, the platform as such is a kind of grouping of people coming from all sorts of walks of life, and I haven't managed to really get an overview of all the things it's been achieving, but when it comes to the managing board, which works between the platform meetings, that's something I'm involved in, and we have proposed a platform which is dedicated to local and regional government, because it's apparent that the goals can't be achieved without mobilization of all the people involved, civil society of course, but even at local and regional level. If those levels aren't convinced of the need to implement policies which respond to the SDGs, then whatever we do in this parliament, nothing will actually come to pass. So this is really a call I'm putting out to you. You have to convince the local and regional level, and that means the way to do that is not just by imposing rules on them or defining rules which they have to apply. It's also through helping them to change their model of development. Now, I heard Pervenche Berès saying earlier that basically the desire to change can stop at the door of the mine, as I understood her to say, and this is true. Yesterday I was in the urban intergroup and I was saying, well, if you really want to change things, is Europe capable of changing and proposing a different model from the other continent? Can it invent a new development model? And even if it is able to do that, will the trade unions and our German friends be prepared to change the way in which they're developing the car, say, just by way of example? Are we all convinced that electric fishing is a bad thing? Now, of course, here we might be convinced of that, but are we all convinced that we need to make insulation of buildings a priority? Energy renovation. I'm here with Erika, who's a director of European Affairs. We would carry out lobbying for local governments, and this parliament for a long time, at the initiative of the Greens, been pressing for 3% of public buildings to be renovated every year so that they're more energy compatible. And we've opposed that, and we win every time, but it's really stupid, because when it comes to the principle of things that the local authorities should be doing, they say they haven't got the money to renovate 3% of their public buildings every year, even if they know it's necessary. And then, of course, there's the subsidiarity angle as well. So what I'm saying is, if you want to propose a different model, you have to have a transition period, and you have to work towards that. And others were saying you need very clear goals as well. Well, I have enough experience to have been through this whole period of the Millennium Development Goals, which never really came to much. So then we brought in the SDGs. I remember the Lisbon strategy, which was a failure, and now they're talking about the 2020 strategy, which isn't much of a success either. And every time, the reason why it doesn't come to anything is because we don't apply these public policies. In other words, the people who are responsible at local and regional level, they're not involved in the design phase. So we have to set up policies which will allow the involvement of local and regional government right at the start. I have a lot of other things to say, but I've only got 30 seconds, so I would just like to say that we looked at the Commission's proposals with interest on the cohesion policy. We think it should be going further. We're keeping a weather eye, as Mr. Andrieux was saying, on the CAP and rural development, because very often when you talk about those policies, you talk about the big cities and forget all the intermediary level, the medium-sized towns and the rural areas. And after all, most of the European population does live in medium-sized towns, not in the big cities. So I'll stop there for the moment, but I hope I'll have an opportunity to come back.
Frederick, thank you very much. I'm sure we could go on much longer, and we definitely will do. What's interesting as well is participation is not just about design, it's also within the implementation as well, and that sort of that aspect of it is very important. And equally, the one thing we haven't mentioned, of course, is that there will be political differences between local regions and national, so those tensions that come in with this economic model and the challenge of that shift. Now we shift to Thierry Lucas, who is head of the United Nations Environment Brussels office, to give your perspective on what you've just heard.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity for me to talk in front of you. I'll, in my presentation, take some of the examples in the previous panel and also some of those ones to bring that in a global perspective. Today, air pollution in Brussels is as bad as the one in New Delhi. That's what I learned this morning when I was waking up, and I was amazed because, I mean, I have asthma, and I was wondering, okay, is it the kind of world I want to give to my children in the future? In Brussels, clearly not. And the challenge will be, I'm sure New Delhi will progress a lot on air pollution. Did we progress so much as Europeans? No, we didn't. And today also, it's this, 70 businesses together in New Delhi, EU, India, on circular economy, meeting to think about, okay, what should be circular economy of tomorrow. That's quite interesting because, again, if you take the agenda, the environment agenda of this year, that's plastic. And why did plastic came as, a surprise for us as UN Environment, as the big topic on environment this year? Well, simply, as it was said at the previous session, because that talks to everybody, and you can talk about that, I can talk about that with my children in the breakfast. They do understand the impact on the day-to-day on the plastic, and they do understand the impact on the fishes, on the whales, and on the planet globally. So one of the things we have to do is to talk to territories, to talk to the people, but on anything we do politically, and Brexit is a good example on that, we need to be practical, down to the earth of what does it mean. Second message is that we see Europe now as UN Environment not in a good trajectory, not on the way to sustainability, not on the way to equitability as well. And for us, we see three main axes of development. One was mentioned, food is critical, and we hope that after 2020, that's going to be one of the key topics being addressed here. Why? Because food is about EU footprint outside of Europe. Our consumption patterns impact a lot on palm oil, cocoa, coffee, in Africa, in Asia, and we have solutions for that. Second aspect is energy use. Well, energy use, Europe is going in a good direction, but it's forgetting completely the people you are targeting here, the poorest one, the medium size. And why? Because there's a number of courage to take to make this energy use available for this society. And when you bring, for example, the issue of new housing in France, in our country, well, none of them are sustainable. Why? It's cheaper after 15 years, and all studies show that, to build from the beginning sustainable housing. So that should be mandatory, and that will help those people there to get a better living. Third topic, mobility. Yes, clearly, that's also really important. The poorest don't have access to some parts of the cities. The cities are now becoming, all across the world, kaleidoscope of inequalities, seeing more and more difficulties for people to access the same cultural values, the same rights, and the same political power. So we have a big issue on that, and mobility is one of them. Now, let me give you some examples of what works and what could work in the future. The CAP reform, for example. I mean, I wanted to end with that, but I think it's really important because that's where the EU puts so much money. And that's where the EU should have a say. And I mean, like my colleagues from European Environment Bureau said yesterday, we have to apply the principle of, do we provide goods on water biodiversity with the cap that we have? No, we don't. Clearly not. So the EU has a role to say we have to put targets so that this money is used by all territories all across Europe to bring those safeguards. Green economy, really important to embark on that. I mean, to come back to what Pervenche said, yes, sustainable finance has been a good work, and we acknowledge that on what has been done. What is good also is the starting of the work on life cycle assessment, and also to think about the next generation, the younger one. The younger one will be dematerialized. We don't, I mean, I was buying CDs to listen to my music. I love that. I mean, I have those still in my room, I mean, many years after that. The younger generation doesn't, neither. But a lot of products will be completely dematerialized in the future. So let's project ourselves in 10 years' time to see, okay, what do we need? Do we need the product or do we need the services? We need the services. So that's really important to think about that in the future of Europe, and also to be competitive with the big emerging markets like in India and China. Third point, innovation. What we want in the future is European young people to still be leading on economic development with the transition we see. And the transition in China and India is huge. Talk about urban development, and it's easier in China, of course, but they start from the beginning, full sustainable cities. And they have a lot of knowledge on this topic. So we need to think about our own education system as Europeans to see how can we bring innovation higher. We still have a comparative advantage as Europe with our universities, with the things we do, but that is not translated at the political level. So still, I mean, the political level accessing the power in Europe does not have the basics on natural capital, on ecosystems, and that's something that is going to be hampering us. And to conclude, as I said, cities are really important because that's also where the changes will happen. If you take the example of Ghent, that was SDG city last year, fantastic things which have moved. I mean, I was discussing about urbanization with Milano, great things happening in Milano in terms of rebuilding the community. And in all cities, I mean, at all levels. That's where we can have the SDGs happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thierry. I think what's an important point to take away from this as well, I mean, this is particularly true where I come from in London, is this challenge you were saying about it can be cheaper to produce unsustainable housing. We're changing a lot of our heat production systems for social housing at the moment in London, and the numbers don't add up. It's not possible to future-proof heat provision at the moment for the poorest people because they will not accept it. It will cost too much. And so how that transition happens and how it's supported is a challenge because the money is not there, unfortunately. And so finally, Stella, taking it to Italy, Stella Bianchi is National Secretary of Partito Democratico in charge of Agenda 2030 and Sustainable Development. So I'm hoping you will give us the answers for how to do it.
Well, giving the answer could be slightly a hard task for me, but I will start with some general consideration that I'm sure we all agree with. The first one, I think it's a matter of awareness and a matter of choice. A matter of awareness is because we need to change the economic model. We need a new model model for development. And a matter of choice is because we have simply to recognize that the Agenda 2030 gives us the framework we need to do this. The idea that these 17 goals we all are perfectly aware of brings up together social, economic, environmental, institutional sustainability is quite a revolution for us. all of a sudden, let's say, it's not all of a sudden, of course, but 2015, we have received this broad agenda that shadows all our core values. What we, as socialists, as social democratic parties, as parties of the left, choose the definition you would like to have. What are we asked for by our, by the ones who want to be represented from us? Social justice, protection for environment, equitable growth, sound institutions. All of this resounds in the Agenda 2030. It is easy to implement it. No, of course not. As any transformation, it is not easy. Is it more difficult because it is so, you know, it has such an enormous scale, having everything inside? More difficult because of that, but also easier because of that. Because if you look at the single issues, there are policies. Christina Gallak was mentioning some of them before. There are policies, every policies talks to each other. And there are measures that can influence all the others. Think of education, think of gender equality, think of the prerequisite for everything in our future, which is climate change. Think of opportunities, think of social exclusions. Those policies reinforce the result we can have for other policies. And those policies, this Agenda 2030 is exactly the European model. It shadows the European model. What we are proud of, social protection, our environmental protection, possibility for growth, stable democracies. This is what somehow is in danger now, what is receiving threats from abroad, as Udo Bullmann was saying at the very beginning, from outside European Union, from inside European Union. I come from Italy, so you can imagine what I could be saying, and I'm not saying it. But it is what we have to proudly and strongly defend and promote and put at the very center of our message and at the national level and of our message at the European level. So, well, I say it clearly. I hope the Agenda 2030 will be strongly and strongly the message we will give as Partito Democratico in Italy, but I also really hope it will be very, very strongly the message the PSE will give at the European election, which is coming, because we have to say to the people what kind of future we imagine, how we would like to involve young people, what kind of hope we can have, what kind of change, because change is necessary, but what kind of change we want to build for ourselves, for our societies, for next generations, for us, for better quality of the life we are living in these days. I come to mayors because it is the core issues of these sessions, but also because mayors are at the forefront of this challenge. Cities are so important because cities are absorbing an enormous quantities of natural resources, but also can be a very, very positive actors for change if they use it properly with new energies, with energy efficiency, with good services, smart cities, and all the things we know. And again, cities are the biggest employers, we can say. But also, in cities, we have the strongest social exclusions. So, in cities, we have every time, in every matter, possibilities, opportunities, and obstacles to be overcome. I would say, I don't know if I'm optimistic in this. I was mentioning this before. I'm sure that my impression is that successful, let's say leftist, mayors from the center-left, from the left, are already applying Agenda 2030 because they're dealing in their cities with social exclusions, with opportunities, with mobility, with food security, with providing opportunities, with bettering school services, and the list can continue through the 17 goals. So our successful mayors, if I think of Milan in Italy, if I think of Bologna, if I think of Brescia, of Ancona, our good mayors, our successful mayors are already applying Agenda 2030. What we should be doing is building on awareness that they're moving in this framework and putting to value the action they are already taking it, explaining it that it is already possible, that they're doing it already, and making it a case for applying it regularly, for making it a model for our development. Our aim is to listen to our mayors, yes, at the first days of October, but we will let you know. Listen to our mayors and build with them a proposal for a national urban agenda for sustainability, with the idea that there should be a national plan to provide a framework for cities, of course allowing and ensuring that the mayors have all the autonomy and the responsibility for the policies they're implementing and for the choice they're making with the citizens, but there should be kind of a national infrastructure to help those policies.
Great, thank you very much, Donna. So you've heard about how this can be taken down now to the local and regional level. What kinds of thinking about what the panelists have said? Does anybody have any kind of further reflections from either where you are or where you see things happening, or how this could be really realised at that lower level rather than just at the EU level or at the national level? Yeah, right at the back.
Hi there, my name is Theodore. I was participating in an initiative between the European Union and the African Union, and it was in Ethiopia. And there we conceptualized something that was the replication of cities, and basically using the external finance of the external financial instrument of the European Investment Bank to basically have an inclusive dialogue with the local citizens and see where are the problems, and basically try to use the readily available patterns elsewhere and bring them. Because we do have certainly in Asia some projects for starting cities from zero, and a lot of strategies here, let's say for circularity, but those are kind of dispersed and there is no unified model. So it could be a great idea just to have a subnational kind of decentralized connection that establishes circularity, and not only the missions that are basically business targeted.
Thank you very much. Anybody else? Anybody who didn't get a chance to kind of talk in the first session who wants to talk now? Yeah, would you like to respond, Pedro?
Yeah. Well, first of all, we are engaged in many cooperation development projects. We have a platform called Platforma, which sees how to cooperate with Africa mostly, but also with other continents on these fields and development in general. We have we have the Covenant of Mayors. I don't know if you are aware of what this is, but in Europe we have developed the Covenant of Mayors for energy and climate about 12 years ago. And now we are working at global level, also with other partners. And in Africa, CMR is implementing the Covenant of Mayors Sub-Saharan Africa with our partners locally, with the idea to propose an urban development that is not too expensive in terms of energy use and climate consequences. I would like to mention that if you are interested, we brought a few publications that we did this summer about sustainable development goals, how Europe, towns and regions are implementing them, and how are they cooperating with their partners outside Europe to implement them. But unfortunately, it was all taken very fast. But you can find it on our website if you want. But what I would like to say also, and this is also for Europe, yesterday at the Urban Intergroup, one of the members of the parliament who was coming back from China was mentioning that in China, when a city wants to change its bus from diesel fuel to electrical, it takes about 2 weeks to change all the buses. When, of course, in Europe, we need to have a project, a plan, a program. We need to go to the EIB, and it can take several years before the whole buses are changed in a city. So that's part of the problem, you know. And this is true for buses, but this is true for many other policies or investments. Sometimes we are in a very long-term strategy when we should allow cities and territories to have the possibility to make the change much faster. And also what I would like to mention is that we often in Europe highlight good examples, and there are many in many cities, best practices, best projects, eco-quartier and whatever, and so on. But too often, and I say that, and I understand why it is like this, but very often, you know, a mayor will promote an eco-quartier and be very proud about it, but what happens in the rest of the city is not sustainable. So we don't need any more best practices. We need practices that answers the need of the SDGs and the change if we want to make change, because otherwise we will never reach the goals. And I would like to mention for a last word that this year, for the first time since about, I think, 15 years, the emissions of gas emissions in Europe are growing, are back to growth. So we are supposed to reduce them. So clearly the objective of 2020 will not be reached, but not only the objective will not be reached, but we are reversing the thing. So this is a call for emergency.
Frederick, thank you. Just to say what's interesting is just in China, sort of with the example that it's faster to be able to put investments in. I was on a task force in China on precisely sustainable development, and the one challenge they have got is exactly the same as here, silos. There is no policy coherence between the environmental departments and the finance, and so they have exactly the same thing. So plus ça change, unfortunately, this is a challenge for every country, is how to bring it together. I just want to ask the panel, just Catherine, before I come to you, is there's been a lot of talk about the urban agenda, about cities, and about mayors. Eric, you mentioned it earlier, which is the problem of rural areas, because there we are seeing inequalities arising across Europe, and particularly with rural areas across all of our countries. How can we ensure that this doesn't just become a city agenda and increase the inequalities between cities and outside? Frederick, you've just spoken. Eric.
Non. Moi, je crois qu'on ne peut pas passer de la période dans laquelle nous sommes.
I don't think we can do all of this without looking at the substance, and of course the MDGs are part of that, but there's a disconnect between what is in the MDGs and what is being put in place at European level by way of policies. Look at the CAP. I mean, the MDG is planning through to 2030, but, you know, that's out of step with the programming for the Common Agricultural Policy. And you mentioned that the funds there are going down. But today, we're really not reacting under the CAP to the challenge and to the challenges as identified under the MDGs by the UN. And the problem is that we should be thinking at a time horizon of 2050, and there'll be 9 to 10 billion people on the planet. We need to know how to feed them, and security of supply is important there. And we need to look at how agriculture can establish a link between human health, the environment, and growing the right crops. But that's not what the European Commission is doing in the future CAP. They continue doing what they've been doing for 50 years. They're concentrating effort, industrial farming, but they're not looking at the quality of food, soil, quality, humans, and animals. So quite apart from concepts and theory, there's this hard reality, which is that nothing's changing. And over the next few months, we'll be deciding for the following decades. And to then counter that will be even harder. And now is the time to act. In 20 years' time, it will be too late. If you then look at rural areas and urban areas and the fact that people increasingly are moving to cities where our wealth is held now, well, if you want to counter that, we need to make sure that we understand these challenges and include them in all of the legislative proposals that are being prepared. And that work also needs to be done in Parliament. And if Council is not willing to play its part, then we, as representatives of the 500 million Europeans, need to make sure that these challenges are heard and that we can have a shift in how we tackle these issues. And it's now that we need to make this, that we need to achieve this.
Just, yeah, Thierry.
Juste brièvement par rapport à ce qu'a dit Eric.
Just quickly to react to what Eric was saying. Access to finance. We work with Rabobank on 2 countries that are very important to us. India, in Andhra Pradesh, where we're trying to change agriculture and the way it's done there. But in order to obtain financing from Rabobank, and we're seeking 20 million, you need to mobilize $1 billion. So the paradigm that is working there should also be put in place in Europe. We know that there are resources that will allow us to promote short supply chains, and that will work to the benefit of rural areas. We have examples of those in Italy and elsewhere in Europe. So we know it can work, but they need access to financing. They need access to these possibilities. If you look at France, how much organic produce goes into retirement homes and so on, we've carried out a study, and there's not a great deal, and it's the public sector that needs to make sure that those products can make it in to those homes and so on. 2016, for example, I mean, billions of dollars paid towards fossil fuels. You know, unless there can be a shift in paradigm, we won't be competitive and we won't meet the challenges.
Thank you very much. I think that's raised a huge challenge. That's going to take a lot of work to be able to kind of bring that side of it in, which I know as part of the Commission that we really need to focus on. I would like to say at this point, thank you again to this panel. I mean, there is so much richness in what we're talking about. Again, if you have got questions you've not been able to ask, please feed them through to all of the people here from the S&D group, and we'll be able to continue those afterwards. So thank you to everybody again for their excellent contributions. Thank you very much.
And this is for...
Yeah, I've read that actually.
You did?
Yeah. If everybody just like to get some water, we're starting again in just about a minute. Okay, I hope everybody's got a coffee. If you haven't got one, just pick one up from the side and we'll just be starting now. Okay, so far we've been tackling some of, I think, of the biggest challenges you can possibly tackle, from what happens with governance to how this is going to be implemented at local and regional level. And one of the key things that is absolutely crucial to the SDGs is no one left behind, and also SDG 16, which focuses very much on making sure that all stakeholders are involved, not just in the design of what is going to happen and to change, but also in the implementation as well. And it's something that perhaps there have been, I know that the SDG platform for the EU has put a challenge up to say, to be honest, a lot of the institutions in the EU haven't been as inclusive as they could be of the stakeholders that are necessary to make this transition happen. So it will take all sectors of society, it will take people, we've talked about culture, it will take business, civil society, and the unions as well, to be part of making this a reality. So what is this going to mean? What does this mean for the EU in how it might need to change the way that it looks at policy, the way the institutions work, and how also does it work the other way? How does it work for stakeholder groups themselves to think different ways of engaging with Parliament at levels from the local to the EU? So our first speaker is going to be Seb Dance, who is an MEP on environment. He's an MEP and sits on the Committee of Environment, Food and Public Health. Seb doesn't actually appear to be here. So we won't be having Seb. If he comes, he can speak later. So our first speaker is now our second speaker, who is Giulio Iacono, who is Stakeholder Relations Coordinator for ASVIS, which is the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development. Giulio.
Thank you. How lucky. The second became the first. Okay, good afternoon. We just organized as Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development the Sustainable Development Festival, and this edition went beyond our expectations. We had more than 700 events all across Italy for 17 days, one for each Sustainable Development Goal. And at the very beginning of each event, and hundreds of thousands of citizens participated to the festival, and the Italian citizens were very responsive, active online, because our messages reached more than 4 million users on Twitter and Facebook, so a quite good success. And at the very beginning of each of these 700 events, we proposed this video that I would like to share with all of you. Shared with our audience, because one of the problem here, as someone already mentioned before, is that there is no awareness. People are not aware enough of the agenda, and we need wide and persistent communication campaigns. For example, more than 500 articles on the festival were published by the Italian media. We know that ordinary people often do not know what we are talking about when we talk about the agenda. So we need initiatives to involve citizens. For example, I think about the high-level political forum, which is the appointment where each country is called to commit and to present their own national voluntary review. But when citizens read in a newspaper, at high level, it's not for me, as a citizen. So we need to involve citizens as a first issue. As a second issue, the Italian Alliance for Sustainable Development signed a memorandum of understanding with the Ministry of Education to promote sustainable development education into the schools. We create a national contest to involve schools and to feature the most creative projects on the agenda and on the SDGs. And hundreds of schools have been involved in this. And we also created an e-learning course on the agenda, finalized to create awareness on the agenda. It was the initial target were the teachers of the Italian schools, but at the end, a lot of companies, enterprises, for all their employees, for example, are asking for this e-learning course to create awareness on the agenda in their companies, in the enterprises, and also all our members. You notice that we have more than, in the video it was mentioned 180. Actually, there are more than 200 organizations which are members of ASVIS, and they are the most important civil society organizations, foundations, universities, environmentalist associations, consumerists, and so on. And the third pillar, I would say, is the report, which is this publication that we present each year at the Italian Parliament. And with this publication, we try to assess how Italy is implementing the agenda, even at regional level, because our experts, our working group are developing some set of indicators to assess how Italy is implementing the agenda at the national level, also at the regional level. How to evaluate the impact of different kind of policies, and also there are some policy proposals coming from our experts. More than 300 experts worked on each year on this report, coming from our members. So we are very proud of these results, of course. Thank you.
Gino, thank you very much. I mean, the issue of awareness raising has come up throughout, I think, the day, and it's always struck me why we aren't using some of the SDGs to actually talk from where people are coming from as well. So not just the whole lot, but saying if you're in a rural area or you're in the coastal area, what is of particular interest, and then moving from there out, talking to people with those concerns at the time. Moving on to civil society, our next speaker is Tanya Cox, who's a Senior Policy and Advocacy Manager for Plan International EU Officer, who has to cover all NGOs. So, Tanya.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to start with a confession. When I looked at the brief in the programme, I thought, this sounds really positive. It's made to sound almost simple. And of course, it's really true that if we increase the participation of citizens in the design and the implementation of Agenda 2030, that's going to be absolutely critical to achieving the objectives of it. But in practice, this is very complex. And just two things that occurred to me when I was thinking about this event was, well, what would be the aim? What do we want to achieve by involving them? And how would we do it? And then we got a double whammy, because we're also looking at the private sector in this. And there's no such thing as just one private sector. And I think that's the first thing that I'd like to flag. It's not a homogeneous sector. There's a huge difference, for example, between micro, small, and medium enterprises and multinational corporations. And I think that, therefore, one's answer has to be extremely qualified when we're trying to look at this issue. So I'm going to share a few thoughts, and maybe we can pick up on some of them in the discussion. As regards incorporating citizens in achieving sustainable development, and my first thought of, well, how would we do this? There are a number of different roles that both citizens and civil society could be playing. Firstly, of course, we would want them to be changing their own lifestyles. I'll set that aside for the moment. Citizens would also be able to enable dialogue. They would be able to share ideas. They would be able to educate others, mobilize people. Civil society often provides services which can be extremely important, especially to poorer people or poorer communities. And civil society and citizens can monitor progress. They can hold governments and local authorities and other bodies to account. Are they meeting their commitments, the promises that they made around the 2030 agenda? If I just take that one of those roles, if you like, first, there's the idea about sharing ideas and contributing to dialogue. We all know, I hope, in this room at least, that the best decisions are going to come out of processes where you involve people who are actually directly concerned by what you're trying to decide on. So people with the experience, they're often the experts in it. And here I'd like to be blunt, like Pedro encouraged us to be. People are, in general, seen and treated as consumers, not as individuals with the right and the desire to have their opinions heard and to be able to shape their lives and the society around them. So in the current system, the little participation which exists for ordinary people is actually based on choice, not on voice. So choice fits with this consumerist model where you're given options which you can either accept or reject. But the voice model, which would be a much more democratic model, is where we say what we think. We contribute our ideas and our solutions. But this isn't really what's happening. And because of this, the basic governance structures, and we've talked about governance a lot this afternoon, the basic governance structures that we would need are not there for genuine, regular participation. So, for example, even just information, the information flows, the processes, the mechanisms, they're not there, or not enough, let's say. And unfortunately, sustainable development per se isn't going to be the topic that's going to get people rushing out onto the streets. We've heard it a number of times. Joe Schmo on the street doesn't get it. He doesn't know what it is. He may not even heard the term sustainable development. Now, it's true that some of the issues, like you just said, Andrea, might bring somebody out on the streets or make them want to participate. So things around, for example, livelihoods and jobs, or basic service provision, or climate change. But supposing they were then motivated to actually want to participate in some way, we're also facing the situation of shrinking space, shrinking civic space. And that's all over the world, including in Europe. I looked at the Civicus Monitor report for 2018, so it was produced in March 2018, and according to that, only 4% of the global population actually lives in countries where they have open societies. And in a good number of European countries, societies, the civic space is narrowing. And then we have Hungary, where it's actually obstructed. What's Europe doing about that? On the accountability role of citizens and civil society, I think we can suffice to say that governments generally are less than keen to be held to account, especially for commitments which are going to cost a lot and actually are quite difficult because they involve a lot of change, transformative change. So there's going to be pain involved. So they're not going to be creating the opportunities for ordinary people to participate. Plus, citizens will also be bound to ask questions about the private sector. the impacts of the private sector perhaps on their lives, on the environment, especially, and here I want to qualify, about maybe the multinational corporations where the impacts can be greater and perhaps in some instances more negative. The private sector isn't too keen on that either. So they can play a considerable role also in trying to keep citizens' participation to a minimum. So maybe I move quickly on to the role of the private sector or the business sector in achieving sustainable development, because it's true that they do have an extremely important role to play. Okay. The private sector isn't homogeneous, so I think we need to be clear that there's going to be different roles for different types of enterprises. So for example, if we look at MSMEs, so micro, small and medium enterprises, social enterprises, family farms, that kind of thing, I would really encourage us to increase our focus on them, invest a lot more in them, and also promote their participation in the local and the regional value chains. They create the most jobs, they have different business models, they're more socially and environmentally aware, often. I mean, I'm generalizing obviously here, but for the sake of argument. Whereas we know well that many of the multinational corporations need to make huge changes to their business models, huge changes, especially in order to focus much more on the social and environmental impacts of their operations. And for this, I think what we need to be thinking about more and more is actually increasing the regulation and the oversight and having far less emphasis on voluntary measures because they're going to be too little and too late. So maybe I just conclude to say that this isn't an easy subject, talking about participation. It sounds nice, it sounds easy, but in actual fact, there's no simple solution. There's a lot that needs to be put in place for this to actually happen. But there's no question about it that it would definitely democratize society. And so what I would like to do is to urge everyone to vote for enlightened leaders, be an enlightened leader, be an enlightened politician with the courage and the willpower to actually make a break with the current system. Because then we definitely will have better solutions for everyone. Thank you.
Tanya, that was absolutely fantastic. I thought you were only going to cover one stakeholder, and you did everyone so beautifully. I just want to add one point, which is, I think when you look at, particularly at local level, when they've been trying to include local citizens within decision-making, one of the problems has been that there is a cultural problem often within some of the officers who are not used to that way of working. So I think there's something about people learning who are delivering these policies that they can engage and how to do that. And I think some of them are quite scared. So I think some of the ways to go forward are going to be interesting. So Bernardine, Boss, there was a challenge there about thinking about different kinds of business and particularly perhaps thinking small first, rather than always going straight to international businesses. So what are your thoughts?
I actually, to a great extent, I really approve of what you were saying, but I will elaborate on that later on. First of all, I'm representing CSR Europe, which is the business network here at the European level of at the big multinational companies. But also representing the national partner organizations in the different European countries, which represent also the smaller and medium-sized enterprises as well as some social enterprises. So it's all in our network. So it's we represent like about 10,000 enterprises here in Europe that all are very serious about corporate social responsibility. Now, what is corporate social responsibility? When we are talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, and I guess that I think that if we go back to the original definition of corporate social responsibility, it is about creating added value in 3 dimensions: in people, the social dimension, the economic dimension, and the environmental dimension. It's about being transparent, and it's about being in dialogue with your stakeholders. And I'm afraid that the political discussion about corporate social responsibility has focused a lot on avoiding the negative impact of businesses, but has not spent so much time on the positive impact that businesses can also create. even the wording, the negative impact and the positive impact, are kind of old economic language, because we need another economic model, and that has been said before. And we fully support that. So we do not need to think in negative impact and positive impact. We should think about the role that business can play in providing solutions to the Sustainable Development Goals, the challenges that the world is facing. So that is very much the focus now of CSR Europe and also of the national partner organization. How can we facilitate businesses and have this impact and the impact on the Sustainable Development Goals? So that is, so how do we do that? In all of these countries and also at the European level, we are working more and more on collaborative projects, because we feel that collaboration is key. We have to collaborate for impact. The SDGs have to be translated, for instance, also to the sectoral level, the industry level, because they have to become more concrete, more specific for a specific sector or industry. What we do is we bring the companies together, big and small. Actually, at the European level, that is still difficult, but at the national level, that is easier to do, because the big companies and the small companies can really learn from each other, and they have to collaborate, because neither of them can provide a sole solution for a specific or cannot have the impact, because we have to change the economic system together and to solve the challenges together. So we facilitate collaboration within a sector, but also cross-sectoral and also in multi-stakeholder setting. Because we feel that there's already a lot of technology available, technological innovation available to solve solutions, but what we need is social innovation, that is collaboration in a specific sector and throughout the value chain. So CSR Europe is focusing on, well, it is participating in the multi-stakeholder platform, the EU multi-stakeholder platform on the SDGs. And in that platform, we are promoting the industry roadmaps, because we believe that those are very important also to set a target for specific industries. Except for facilitating the sectoral and cross-sectoral collaboration, we also focus on stakeholder dialogues, and we work with the companies on creating new business models, but because we need the new business models and we can only develop them together. So what is needed in order to facilitate this collaboration for impact is financial support for this transition process and also for these collaborative action. It is focusing on multi-stakeholder collaboration, and it's also focusing on scaling up what is already happening at the national level. I myself, coming from the Netherlands, I know, and it has been mentioned here before, for instance, in textiles, there are quite important initiatives in the field of textiles, not only in the compliance, on the compliance side, but also on creating added value, on creating circular textile production, for instance. So, yeah, I have to stop, but there's much more examples also to give, but I think it's also important to focus on scaling up the initiatives that are already out there.
Thank you. Bendine, that was great. And we heard before earlier about textiles as well, and the food and drink sector have been using the SDGs as a way to come together to start to think about how that works. I think the challenge is going to be not just the consumer-facing sectors, but those that are the B2B and others, which are, let's say, well behind, I think, the trends that are happening and how are those brought in. But that sector dimension is really important. One group that we haven't talked about yet has been that of the trade unions. So Mathieu Merle is the economics advisor at the European Trade Union Confederation and will no doubt fill the gap in.
Hello, thanks very much for your invitation. Very pleased to be there. So I will, sorry, I wrote it down. I try not to read it, but I'll do my best. We are now celebrating an anniversary. It has not been mentioned today, but it is the 10th or the 11th anniversary of the financial crisis. And may I tell you that I really have the feeling that we are now experiencing a lost decade. And I just give you one figure. Since 2008, at risk of poverty rates in the European Union and the euro area have all increased. And that's the number one SDG objective, as you mentioned. So already, first objective, we have failed. While employment and unemployment looks much better now, at least on the paper, we have to keep in mind a few stuffs. First of all, the total hours worked in the European Union and the euro area are still below what they used to be in 2008. So the level of activity is still below, at least for employment, is below what we have experienced before the crisis. The quality of job is deteriorating, since temporary employment rates, as well as involuntary temporary employment rates, are continuously increasing since 2012 in the European Union and the euro area. 3/4 of temporary employees are involuntary temporarily employed. Part-time jobs are still very high at around 20% of total employment, one-fifth. On wages, things do not look much better. Wage share factor cost, so avoiding taxes on prices, so just depicting what share of wealth is going to labor, what share of wealth is going to capital. They are both decreasing for the European Union and for the euro area since 2012. I'm not mentioning what happened after the Thatcher-Reagan revolution during the 80s. It's a very famous one. However, it has been shouted, oh, it shouldn't be the case, it should increase. Nothing since 2012, it's decreasing. However, we are still in the age of financialization, so the wages wage share have decreased. So you would expect investment to increase if you compress wages, but this is not the case. We are still in the age of financialization, as a diminishing part of profit are invested in the real economy. When private investment was representing 85% of profit in 2001, it now represents 75%. So the least we can say, beyond the call for an increased participation of worker and citizen, the ongoing timid and fragile recovery, it's definitely not inclusive, and that what was considered as unsustainable in 2008 is still developing. Even unemployed people are paying the price. OECD computed compensation rate of an unemployed person and Eurostat expenditure of unemployment-related social protection per unemployed both suggest that unemployed persons have experienced lower benefit rates across Europe. At risk of poverty rate while being unemployed increased in every member state except Italy, Cyprus, Lithuania, Hungary, Malta, Romania, and the UK. The rate of unemployment being at risk of poverty reached its maximum in Germany at 70% of unemployed population, meaning if you're unemployed, you have 7 chances out of 10 to be poor. Would public authority compensate for such misguidance? Not really. Public investment is continuously decreasing since the crisis to such an extent that net public investment is negative in the euro area and just positive for the European Union. And bridges begin to collapse. So now we will have the next ones coming. Together with low wages and job-rich recovery, these made productivity increase at a very low pace. So on a global level, even before speaking of more participation of the citizen to decision-taking at business level, one basic concern should be the consideration of workers. Since the current legislation came into force 12 years ago on worker participation, only 57 legally established European companies have set up board-level representation, whereas 22.4 million companies exist in Europe. The European Commission very recently published its company law package, which facilitates transfer of seats, merger, and division of companies in the single market. In the case of the Commission proposal for company law package, we are confronted with a situation where the different national rules for the transfer of company seat, mergers, and divisions are regulated at European level, but there is no similar requirement for worker representation. The different national rules on information, consultation, and board-level representation rights are not strengthened or complemented by European-level framework. The Commission proposal offers only temporary survival of existing national regulation, and there is no regulation in 10 European member states. This is clearly insufficient. There is no change of paradigm from the shareholder value principle towards the stakeholder approach. Okay, this is still work in progress, but we still have a lot to do. It will also not prevent implementation of letterbox company for tax avoidance purposes. The ETUC adopted a position in 2016 already on the orientation for a new EU framework on information, consultation, and board-level representation rights, requesting worker representation and adequate information and rights. But it has not been followed completely, as you can understand. Finally, confidentiality is a topic that has been addressed very carefully, that has to be addressed very carefully. However, too many topics are now qualified as confidential by management. We are here especially referring to the public country-by-country report from multinational companies. Indeed, the directive had been downgraded because of business secrecy, and we will perhaps fail on this dossier. So I'm now finishing. Since we are not even able to share information, how could we cure the present issue on tax havens or supply chains, for example? Where is collaboration? We are not even able to share common information for a common future. So it's difficult to say that we are on the right track for establishing the sustainable development goal. And as I told you, when you see that just the first principle has not been able to be ensured, you can be worried. Thanks very much. Sorry about it.
Mathieu, thank you. I think you've also written the chapter for the Commission on Sustainable Equality on a particular area, so thank you as well for that. Seb, I introduced you once at the beginning. Unfortunately, you actually weren't there. You are now here. Hearing what everybody has said, what are your reflections on how we can move forward?
Well, thank you very much. And I think I got everybody's, I came in at the first presentation, so apologies for missing the very start. But the common theme, obviously, here is participation and the ability to shine a light on what is going on across all areas, whether it be business practice, tax practices, whether it be our environmental policy, whatever it be. The idea that the citizen has a role to play is obviously paramount. And that's really where I wanted to start my comments. For those who don't know, I was the rapporteur on the Sustainable Development Goal file that went through this Parliament last year. And, you know, it was an incredibly awkward process to start with because actually this, if I could be frank, and I know that Commissioner Sefcovic is in our presence, so apologies for this, but there was a kind of tick box exercise where this process began, i.e. if we have the SDGs here, we will carry on with our existing work programme, look back and see how we can somehow force what we're doing into the list and then kind of work out what progress we're making. And obviously that's not the way to go about it. And I like to think that the report that this Parliament put through, with the keen backing, I should say, of the really hard work of the Secretariat and Anna, who plays a modest role, but was absolutely instrumental in the work that we did to get that through. The report that this Parliament put through was really a riposte, I think, to that idea, and it was really aiming to make sure that the SDGs are thought of from the very beginning. This is a process that you have to start from, not a process that you end up in. This isn't, you know, corporate social responsibility. Let's have a look back and see where we did. Someone will deal with that, and then, you know, we'll try and retroactively put that through. And that really is key. But we have to talk about how we communicate properly with citizens, because as has been said, most people don't know what the SDGs are. All of us in this room, I think, would let's put our hands up and say how many of us have adapted our lifestyles in a way that we can be truly confident that we are individually meeting the 17 SDGs in all aspects of our lives. I mean, for goodness sake, this Parliament uses these bottles. And we've been on and on and on about it. It's a simple thing. We could have water coolers, and even that is impossible because of the way in which the contracts are designed for the way in which the Parliament... I'm sure there are very lovely water companies and all the rest of it, but for goodness sake, this is a very good example of where that change is incredibly difficult. And I, for one, would love to revolutionise the way in which I lead my life, but I bet if I were to do an audit now, today, of the way, from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed, of the things that I do and the services I use and the products I consume, I would be shocked, which is probably why I haven't done it. It's probably why I should do it. It's probably why all of us should do it. But actually, that requires a level of self-awareness that is simply not there at the moment, and that's our role really in a leadership position, to get that awareness out there. And of course we've talked about the roles that other organisations can play. NGOs absolutely have a huge role to play, obviously, because you can insert yourself into a political agenda in a way that perhaps others can't. But we have across Europe, in my own country, for example, slightly watered down version, perhaps, compared to other countries like, for example, Hungary. But we do have measures to restrict the freedom of civil society in European member states, and that has to stop. That has to stop. And we have to be clear and unambiguous in opposing it. Businesses have been talked about. I don't have long, so I'm going to my parting shot is to my colleagues here. Whether or not I participate in the next elections is a rather moot point at the moment, but obviously the impact of these elections will be huge for everybody, whether or not you're in the European Union or it'll have huge impacts for the world. And that is, of course, we cannot be the ones to shy away from the difficult decisions and the hard messages that need to be made, because quite frankly, if you were to go out there now and simply react to public mood on sustainability as an issue, you're not going to get very far, because the leadership hasn't been there in terms of explaining it to people, and the willingness to change simply isn't there. That's where we have to go and make the difficult arguments. We have to explain to people that actually the world of work is going to change far beyond anything that we can currently comprehend, and we need to prepare people for that. And that's why it's so important that we as socialists get that message out there. The just transition is a really important part of that, for example. And for goodness sake, let our watchword be this. It is about transparency. It's about information, because if you shine a light on things, people get involved and they feel empowered. And you know what? At the moment, that is the single biggest thing that people are craving.
And if you're feeling guilty that you've started a bottle, please make sure you take it away with you and use it at least 10 times. Do not dispose of it straight away. I'm aware we want to move on to the next panel, but I think on this one, because it's so important, if you don't mind, the speakers just to have a few minutes, if anybody has any questions that you want to ask or comments about how we move forward on participation particularly. Yes, just very briefly.
Thank you very much. Great speech, Sepp. We have been together in New York, actually. The S&D group has been in New York on the SDG, and we approach, actually, and I'm very thankful that the colleagues are very here also from UN Environment, that the European Union has to report next year, and we have no strategy yet. So we press this issue, and hopefully our group is bringing that across. One important part of civil society and people is cities. They are SDG cities. So there are some cities who built up already a network. In Germany, these are like Bremen, which is also a federal state, Heidelberg, Mannheim, other cities. There are rich cities and poor cities around the world who work on city-to-city approaches on SDGs. Come up, and every society, my city as well, a small city, Lutherstadt-Wittenberg in Germany, East Germany, became an SDG city. So every member of the European Parliament should find one city, not only fair trade cities, but build up SDG cities, because there you have it all, there you can spell it out. Church groups approach me, pastors come, you know, sport groups can do it. You have different textile even on lifeguards and swimming. So this is a great thing. So civil society, city-to-city approach. First thing was fair trade cities, now SDG cities. And we should be a ruling group, bring that in our constituencies and have at least one city in every constituency, and do be loud about that.
Thank you very much. And I think that talks to what was said in the last session as well about really engaging everyone. As long as it's not just cities, rural areas as well must be included.
Microphone, please.
Thank you to everybody for a fantastic session. Please take everything. The final session, so please don't go away and have a drink. We're going to move straight into the next session now. Thank you, everybody. There's been a huge wealth of discussions today, and trying, I think, to expect our three speakers in the final session to do justice to everything that has been said will be impossible. But they have been thinking, I think, about some key interventions that will add to the kind of discussions we've been having and will provide some very thought-provoking ways of taking forward what has been discussed today. And like I said, this isn't the end of it. You have all the details within the leaflets that are there. If you haven't had it, take it out on the way out, and make sure that everything that you hear, think about how we can make this extremely practical, because now it's moving into, because of the elections happening, it's time to start to put this into things which are concrete and tangible. We've heard the challenges. Now it really is time to start to move towards something that really does work. So in our final panel, we're very privileged to have the Vice President of the Commission in charge of the Energy Union, Maros Sefcovic, who has given his time to really, I think, provoke us on certain aspects of what you think should be happening. Maros.
Thank you very much. At first, I also would like to thank the organizers, the Progressive Society, SND, and especially Anna Colombo for really putting together such an impressive program. I'm glad that you've been a little bit behind the schedule, so I can listen to the previous panel and been a little bit debriefed about a lot of innovative and new approaches and ideas we can, of course, use in our daily work. At the same time, it's also great to see that the true convinced Europeans are here in the room, not only the honorable members of the European Parliament, but also my former colleague, Laszlo Andor, Commissioner, who was very much committed to these goals when we've been sitting together in one college, but also Cristina Gala, who is now working for the Spanish government, but has very distinguished career. I think the topic we are discussing today has very strong European colors. If we want to be a little bit unmodest, and you wanted me to provoke the audience a little bit, so I will. So I think that SDGs have been really inspired by the European way of life. And I think we should be proud of it, and we know that not in all aspects we are, of course, living up to the standards, but that was the way of life which was promoted by Europe, by the European Union. And I'm very glad that very much we propose this as a best way forward, as the most modern way of living to the global community. Another very European characteristic is that it's quite obvious that here, if we want to continue this global leadership, I think that what would be very necessary is to recognize that you have to do your homework at home, as Cristina was speaking this morning about the new Spanish government, but at the same time, you have to have good cooperation on the European level. And I think that you've been following very closely what we've been doing together with the European Parliament and our member states over the last 3 years. And again, I would say that it was very rewarding work, because I think we started the most unprecedented and deepest transformation of the European energy systems since they've been built 150 years ago and put on the fossil basis and on centralized power production and distribution. And we are completely reversing the orders. And again, I believe modernizing our economy, our society, in a way which was unthinkable just a couple of years ago. Why is it possible? I think the only way we could achieve this, we started and we need to continue, is because when they ask me abroad what I think is such a major engine for tackling the climate change or for all that transformative processes we started in Europe, I say that the major spur, major momentum creator is actually unprecedented public support we have for these policies. If we compare it with any other major economy, we can say that Europeans truly want to live in sustainable societies, and they're actually pushing us, the politicians, to do more, not less, in this particular area. And I think that this is the positive capital with which we have to work even more in the future. I'm not going to go through all the, climate change, energy, and decarbonization proposals we put on the table over the last few years. But I just would like to highlight two very important things. Where we would need the help of all of you, we would need a strong involvement of the civic society, social partners, progressive forces in our societies. And this is the motivation, the invitation card we sent over to all EU member states. We told them, look what we committed to in Paris. Look what are the new targets for 2030, and I was quite impressed that in the renewables and energy efficiency we could go over what the European Council so famously decided in 2014 and be much more ambitious, which would lead, I'm sure, to more than 40% of greenhouse gas emissions. So you have the big parameters. We are offering you also the new hardware with better interconnections so we can really have a single energy market. We are offering you better software, more modern laws. But what we need the member states' government to do is the homework, meaning how are you going to transform all this into the national energy and climate plan where you, as a government, after consulting social partners, stakeholders, parliamentarians, will tell us how you picture your country in 2030. What you want to have as an energy mix, what kind of clean mobility approach you want to promote, how you want to involve the people in these discussions, so we would not have that usual cycle that 4 years we push in one direction and another 4 years in totally different direction. We need to have a clear, targeted approach and a clear roadmap forward. Therefore, I'm very glad that thanks to the strong support of European Parliament, we actually pushed for the first time in the history of the EU the governance proposal on how these changes and how this energy and climate transition should be governed on the European level. We hope that by the end of this year, we will have these national energy and climate plans coming from all EU member states so we can assess them, we can compare them, and I hope that they will be the subject of my last State of the Energy Union report, which I would like to present to this Parliament in February next year. And that, I believe, would be very symbolic end of the effort which was done during this legislative period in this area. We would have a global framework, new European legislative basis, and also national homework done so we can really start the next decade under the new management, under the new rules, and I believe lead the global economy in transforming the old-fashioned system of economics and put them on low carbon, green, clean basis, which I believe would be a very good selling point for European operators also in other parts of the world, because everyone has to do this transition. We need electricity for the people in Africa, we need clean energy in India, we need to decarbonize the economy in China and the United States, and all of these major economies would need this European approach, experience, and the patent. And if you allow me, the last thing to say in opening of this discussion, and I heard it also by previous speakers, 2030 vision targets, it's important, it's crucial, but I agree with all of you who said that it's not enough, because 2030 is around the corner. If you build a power plant today, for sure it will stay for you another 30, 40 years. If you build unnecessary pipeline today, it will be with you another 50 years. So we need to think anew. What are the stranded assets? How are we spending the public money? And therefore, we are working now very hard to present you by the end of this year with a European 2050 strategy, how we want to go to this carbon neutral strategy, how we want to proceed in this modern way of decarbonization. And I think from the preliminary work which we already conducted, it's very clear that here we are going well beyond energy and climate issues. We are talking about new skills for the young people. We are talking about new incentives for the companies. We are talking about cities how to really mobilize on that fantastic capital which is in our cities and the excellent work most of the European mayors do in this area. And if you would see all the aspects which we need to tackle in this 2050 strategy, I'm sure you will not be surprised that you would see that there is this huge overlap with the SDGs. So then I think you see how the circle is coming back to where it started, and therefore I think that we should definitely work very hard together on making sure that Europe would maintain this leadership, not only now, but also in the next decades, because we know how fierce competition awaits us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just going to change the way we've done the sessions this time and see if anybody has any particular questions for Maris, because I know you can't necessarily stay. Oh, you can. Yeah. I think it'd be nice either from the panel or from the floor for any questions, and we'll do that for each speaker. Yes.
Hello, I'm Ingeborg Nistroy with the SDG Watch Europe. Is it already decided how the EU will report next year at the HLPF? So will that be included, what you are talking about, namely the domestic perspective? Is it already decided how the EU will report about its efforts on SDG implementation next year to the UN?
It's working. I think that, of course, next year, as you can imagine, would be a very institutional one, and I think the people in this room can tell you a lot about it, because they will be quite busy from I believe, March until the European elections are over, and the new Parliament and new Commission is formed. So I think that we will follow the traditional pattern, but I think that before we come to the reporting of the next SDGs, we, I think, have to work with you and find the best way how to actually integrate in our proposals, in our reports, all that work which was done by IPCC panel, by all the relevant studies which been completed this year when we would go to the COP meeting in Katowice, because I think that would be a very important milestone where we would have also to discuss how ambitious we as a global community and as a Europeans will be. What does it mean in practice, the so-called inspirational goal which was added to the Paris Agreement on the last minute by the island nations, who said that for us even 2 degrees Celsius warm up is unacceptable because many of our islands might disappear, and we want the global community to aim closer to 1.5 degree target. So this is what we are very, very busy right now, how to come well equipped with the good messages to Katowice. And of course, I think that would be really a good stepping stone, having a good report and good way how to present the results next year to the UN. Maybe, if you allow me one, because I'm in the European Parliament, please help us to move with the emission standards for cars, vans, and trucks. Please, because because I see that we are stuck and we are kind of running out of time, and I think we need really to complete this work before we go for elections, because I think citizens will not forgive us. I'm sorry for that. Thank you.
We try. Great. So the challenge is there. There's a question over here, and then I just want to abuse my position as chair. So throughout this afternoon, we've been talking about the way that all the different bits of the SDGs have to talk to each other. And so within your area, to what extent are you taking account of all of the other SDGs, not just energy? So it's not just about jobs, it's also about inequalities, it's about territorial change, it's about what happens with seas, etc. So is that awareness there, and is it coming into the governance and the way that you're working?
At first, I have to say that probably, I mean, it's a very nice coincidence, because I came to your conference from our project team meeting on a reflection paper on SDGs. And you would be surprised to hear that there was, if I count correctly, 3 vice presidents and 5 commissioners working together on this reflection paper. And this is actually, I would say, the new way which was introduced by the President Juncker, that he kind of forced us to work on a horizontal basis and as a teams. And therefore, in whatever area we've been working on, we always try to get, I would say, the input from all aspects early on. And to avoid the situations which probably you would remember very well from the past, that one day you got a piece of legislation on environmental issue, next day is on the industrial competitiveness, third day on energy efficiency. And surprise, surprise, not always they've been super compatible, they clashed, and we get a lot of complaints that we are confusing the stakeholders and that actually we are not working on synergies but on divergences. So I think this was the aspect which we started to use, and I think it works pretty well. So in every piece of legislation we put on the table, we try to get input from all the aspects. Of course, always you can do things better, but I think that we here already overcome a big hurdle to work as a team. I know how big challenge it is also in the European Parliament, that sometimes several committees have to deal with one proposal. And I can tell you how big challenge it is when I am on my energy union tour in any member states, and I tell my colleagues, please, but this is cross-cutting issue. Can we sit together, the Ministry for Environment, Ministry of Energy, and Ministry responsible for research? It's an impossible task very often. I think I succeed like 2 or 3 times. So the silo mentality is very much still here. It will take us time to overcome it. We have to show that this is more efficient, that we actually achieve better results, and take even more into account the civic society, stakeholders' view, and public consultations results, because they're very practical contributions which make the laws which are then adopted much more fine-tuned to the real needs of the society.
Great, thank you, Maros. I think that's very heartening to hear, and lots of learnings, I think, for everyone. There's one area that we didn't touch on earlier, but which has come through, I think, in a lot of S&D work, which has been about impact assessment as well, and how if you bring all of the dimensions together, that enables it stops everything being in silos as well. Eric, you had a question.
Oui, merci. Juste quelques mots. Merci, Monsieur le Commissaire, de vos propos.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Commissioner, for what you said. I must say that I share a great deal of what you said. But you said that the Commission is a collegiate body, so you work together with other commissioners. But how come there is this dichotomy then between what you are saying, which I share, and the Commission's proposal then, which is the outcome of the work you do together with others? If you look at the MFF, then what is there is not in keeping with the objectives and not in keeping with the medium and long-term vision that we need. Now, the time horizon for your strategic framework is 2030, but if you look at the MFF and then the Cohesion Fund program and the CAP, it's 2021 and 2027. So that's what we're working on now, and then the rest is 2030 as a time horizon. But we don't have enough resources, and the time horizon is not the right one either to tackle the challenges. For example, if you look under the CAP, agricultural self-sufficiency, security of supply, that's something that we need to deal with. It would be in keeping with the SDGs, but still, we're not putting the right policies in place in Europe. So I was wondering about that dichotomy. Of course, we're aware that this is all very complex, but we're co-legislators in Parliament, and we need to look at the proposals from you, the Commission, and our work is to make sure that we get... And of course, I'm not talking about renationalisation, but again, there's that paradox between having proposals, which are joint proposals, and having to be carried out in member states. But again, I think we need to work together, in particular within the socialist family. Please don't see this as criticism, it's more of a comment. But from a political point of view, with the elections looming large on the horizon, we need to make sure that we speak plainly and speak clearly, and we need to make sure that from an intellectual point of view, what we say is also in keeping with what we do in policy work.
Very passionate questions.
Yes, because I know that also my colleagues are pressed by time. So I would suggest that on peut discuter ça après notre séance. Mais simplement.
We can discuss that, of course, after the meeting. But you're quite right in pointing out that often we have a vision, but then, of course, when you put forward a proposal, you need to make sure that you get the support from the entire college of commissioners. Because, of course, you need to finalise your proposals, and of course we want to also finalise the work done on the MFF before the next elections. All of that work was very difficult, and of course we presented the outcome of that a couple of weeks ago, but I'm more than happy to continue discussions with you, but maybe after the meeting, because I know that colleagues at the top table here also have their views.
That's another reminder, there are cocktails later, so there'll be lots of conversations, I'm sure, following. Now we move to Nicholas Schmidt, who is the Minister for Labour, Employment and the Social and Solidarity Economy of Luxembourg, who I'm sure will be reflecting on many of the issues.
Yes, thank you very much. I was a bit surprised when I read, as the subject of the conference, change the European economic model. And I was not only surprised, I was very interested and happy about that, because it's some time ago, Social Democrats have not talked and spoken about changing the economic model. So this is my first point. This is a very ambitious goal we have now decided, and as ambitious goal, all our the other parties will say, well, this is a big illusion, you cannot change the economic model. Is this realistic or not? First, yes, we can. Why?
Yes, we can.
Because some people have succeeded in changing the economic model. The neoliberals have succeeded in changing the economic model. About 30 years ago, somebody mentioned it with the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. We had succeeded in changing the economic model before, in bringing in very strong social elements in the capitalist society and economy, with the social state and so on. So it is realistic to change the economic model. But it's not only realistic, it's also absolutely indispensable. And I think all the talks and all the discussion we had have shown that it is indispensable, because we are facing huge challenges. And we know exactly that with the functioning of our present economic model, we will not be up to these challenges. The capitalist society and capitalist system, as it works today, is not capable of integrating these challenges and giving the right responses to it. And we have to say it. Now, this is not enough, but we have to say how to do it. And one remark, when one say, well, we are living in a global economy and there is only one system possible. Wrong. The Chinese capitalism, state capitalism, is not working in the same way. So there is some kind of a room for changing the economic model. The problem is how. So I will be very fast. We all have discussed climate change. I think the second big challenge is the disruptions in our society, inequality. And that's for the many. That's the question, the social and the environmental. And when you are talking about energy, you are talking about technology, you are talking about climate change, but you are also talking about the social dimension of energy. And you are talking of a new kind of society, because perhaps tomorrow energy will not function the same way. It's not EDF and the big groups. It will come back to the citizens. It will be local. It will be territorial. It will be more participative. So this is also an important element of the change of an economic model. Now, what is at stake? It's not just the economy. It's not just the déclassement, I don't know how to translate that in English, of broad parts in our society, and especially also of the middle classes. it's democracy which is at stake. And we see it, how democracy is threatened. And with democracy, it's also the European project which is threatened. I would never have believed 30 years ago or even 20 years ago when we were in the convention with Pervenche that one day we should have some fears about the survival of the European model. So I think this is also a very issue. Now, how to do it and what to do? I fully agree that the race to the bottom, as you mentioned it, is lethal, not only for democracy, it's lethal for the whole social cohesion in our society, and is really one of our big threats. Now, we have not the only plan. We are not, as some before believed, that there was one plan to change one system against the other. So we have really to identify, and here I think the SDGs are very helpful. We have to identify all the steps, all the changes, all the things where we really can bring through policies on very specific areas, bigger changes in the whole system. Yes, what you mentioned about energy is important because you can really bring change in the whole system. Now, about governance, one word, because it was mentioned, is the European semester up to that challenge? Obviously not. Obviously not, and Pervenche said it. The European semester has been designed for one very particular, very narrow-minded issue, which is the fiscal issue. And we will not transform the European economic model with this approach. So really we have to rethink also how we deal with this governance at a broader level and how we can use. I think the European semester has its importance, but it cannot respond to this challenge. Now, as social democrats, talking about changing the European economic model, we have to change our narrative. And this is the biggest challenge. Why are we losing everywhere? Because our narrative is not inspiring anymore. Our narrative is not giving trust to citizens. And people have the impression that we are not bringing the really concrete solutions to their problems. And this is the biggest challenge. It's nice to talk about changing the European model, but we have to show that this European economic model as a whole, but through the very numerous actions, changes the concrete life of citizens and people. And this is the biggest, also for the forthcoming election. How can we bring that into a credible approach? But maintaining the turbo-capitalism, maintaining the financialization of economy is not compatible with a respectful approach to the economy, to the environment, integrating SDGs. This is not possible. So we have to work on that. The ideology of share value, the ideology of share value is the total contradiction of bringing in the SDGs, because share value has nothing to do with the respect at the social level as well as on the environmental level. So there is still the big fight against neoliberalism has to go on. It's not finished. And we did not really draw the conclusions out of the crisis of 2007, 2008. Because finally, there's not so dramatic. There's some slight changes, I agree, also in the Commission. But broadly speaking, there is not really a big change. And my last word is, and I was very happy about that, is if we want to change and really be successful in this change, we have to make broad alliances. And certainly trade unions are important, civil society is important, other political forces, certainly we need them also in the forthcoming political negotiation. But I think we have to discuss also with the economic sector. The enterprise is at the heart of the basic of these changes, the enterprise. I attended yesterday a meeting in Paris, and one of the discussion was, how can we change the finality or finalité in French, finalité, well, you understand what I mean, of the enterprise. There is a discussion which has started in France, unfortunately has been very reduced. But the idea is, how can we really use the enterprise and the objective of the enterprise, which still is maximizing profit and share value and looking all the time at the stock exchange. But how can we use the enterprise in this change of the economic model? And I think this is a big challenge. This challenge cannot be won at the national level. It can only be won at the European level. And this is through constructing a new model also of a big enterprise. And I agree, there are very different kinds of enterprise. The small, and therefore we have to push them, we have to encourage startups. But the world economy is nevertheless dominated by big multinationals. So we have also to have some impact on them. This is the question of the GAFAs. This is the question of taxation of the GAFAs. I am a Luxembourger who applauds the taxation of the GAFAs, so please tell my colleague that I have said that here. So this is a big issue, but I think we have to change the enterprises and the logic of the enterprise. There are some beginnings in that way, but we have to push them, and there has to be some regulation and some regulatory framework to go further and to go more rapidly. And my last word is technological change. Technological change, the digital change is there are a lot of risks, but it's up to the political responsibilities to transform these risks in opportunities. And if you take energy, the digital economy is a huge opportunity to change the whole energy system. And this applies to many other sectors, to many other elements in our economy. So use technology to change the European or to change the economic model. I think this is possible, but that needs strong political will to do so and strong also alliances to do. I was very surprised, that's my last word, when I read a report by the OECD, because we were accustomed that the OECD was one of the promoters of the neoliberal thinking. And the report starts with one word: the well-being of people cannot prosper in a divided society. And this is great, that at the OECD one says that. And we have a more and more divided society, and the well-being, well, that's the sustainable growth approaches. So really we have to work on the social and on the environmental and bring both things together. Thank you.
Nicholas, I think that was a call to arms, definitely. And just to say, as Minister for Social and Solidarity Economy, you don't need to answer this now, but if every enterprise was part of that, that is part of creating the new economic model. It's about that diversity.
But that will take a further 500 years.
It may do, but anyway, it's obviously part of it. Mercedes, I'll go straight to you because I think you really want to come in and respond to everything that Nicholas has said. Another Vice President of the S&D Group, for those of you who don't know, which I'm sure you do, and also in charge of Progressive Society. So you have, in a sense, the last word.
Merci. Je vais parler dans une autre langue.
Thank you. I'll pick another European language, not English, so it will be more easy for some to understand. I'm curious and very interested by this whole debate. I've been vice chair of the group and I look after economic issues, but way back I actually taught the economy of the environment, so I've lived through all the enthusiasm and frustrations of all these years from Rio onwards, when sustainable development was first coined, right through till now. with the steps forward and steps back in this whole area. So I believe, I would say first of all, Nicolas Schmidt is right. We have to set the bar very high and say, as socialists and democrats, that we want to change the European economic model. And for the many, so for most European citizens. And we have to point out that it's only Europe that can do that now and serve as a model for the rest of the world. Of course, we would support the SDGs and stick to those, but we do this because our model fits with that, and we want to change it, but it's the closest, it's the most likely one to be able to serve as an example for others, as a model for others that we will help, of course, if they want to follow us. And that's very important for us as socialists, because it's a clear counterposition to Trump, for example. So America is on the right wing now and is doing some incredible things. We won't go into that because we haven't got the time, but it's not interested in the environment at all and refuses even to stick to the commitments it's entered into. We're very different from that, and we want to make progress and see if we can guarantee to citizens a high quality of life and a high level of social services, but also a sound environment and a sound economy. And in this group of progressive society, which is feeding all our thinking on this, a triangle was drawn where you have the economy, the environment, and the social aspect. And I think one could perhaps add culture or the arts, because the arts are fundamental as well. It's people's mindsets, basically, that have to change as well. Culture in that sense of mindsets, ethos. So we should perhaps also see it as a Venn diagram. We have an economic model, an environmental model, a social model, and culture, but they overlap. And these things should gradually overlap more, because otherwise we'll do a bit like what we do here. Everybody who's in the regional policy committee are in favor of regional aspects. Those in favor of the environment are in the environment committee, and those in the econ committee focus on the environment to the exclusion of other things. And that's indeed where we often clash, because we come at things from different angles that we know best. So I think if we set the bar very high and we say to the citizens, this is not just political correctness, this is basically about our future survival. If we cannot combine a new economic policy with a project which will allow future generations to avail of the same possibilities and opportunities as we have now, and guarantee and safeguard the future, at least to the extent that we've safeguarded the present. If we can't change society, because we tend to forget the whole substrate behind everything at the moment. So in the local and regional authorities, we see there are massive problems in cities, marginalization, and the problems of rural and hill communities, which are very much left in the lurch. And where are all the resources going? They need to go to the local and regional authorities, who are the ones who can ensure that this actually is put into practice. So I think we socialists need to speak with a very simple and clear language to explain this to people, the new paradigm, the new model, to explain that Europe is different because it wants to, it will be different because it isn't quite different at the moment. It's better than others, but it's not different really. But it wants to safeguard the future of our children, because the environment, sustainability of the economy is about the future, new generations. So all those who are alive today need to be reminded that what we should be working towards is to guarantee, as you'd say to any living being now, to guarantee the future for our children and grandchildren. And at the same time, what we're trying to achieve is safeguard the lives of our citizens today. So there needs to be a new social model. And we have some pretty good hypotheses on that, on the world of work, as you know. And of course, the economy, as it is not capable of safeguarding our present or our future, or guaranteeing the right social or environmental protection, nor can it even protect the economic model, because you will all have read that the forecast is that in 2 or 3 years, in 2019 or 20, there'll be another big crisis. So this means there's an acceleration of the bubbles which explode eventually, and which means that the economic world will be on its knees again. Not just because we're introducing environmental regulations or social protection, no, because it's the economy itself which creates bubbles which then explode, and the real economy collapses as a result. We really have the impression that the real economy just has to bow to finance, the world of finance, and yet it's the real economy that produces the goods and energy, allows us to do things, the food and so on. But that is totally secondary to these baffling laws for most citizens in the world of finance, but which are there and which regularly involve these bubbles and explosions, the bursting of the bubble. And so we have to look at how to emerge from this cycle. So I think we've heard some great suggestions today, so we need to work on those. Of course, the European semester and the country-specific recommendations will have to be completely revamped. The Commission is proposing that we should look at structural issues first. Well, what we expect is that the Commission will have a different way of looking at the specific recommendations per country, taking into account the goals, the social, environmental, and, of course, economic goals, but which overlap. So these recommendations should change radically. And we also expect that in regional policy, there should be an integration, and there has been to some extent, but there has to be an involvement of the local and regional authorities so that they take on board these goals and drive them forward. And our regional authorities need to understand that you can only create jobs if you also create a sustainable economy in all senses, not just in the environmental sense. And then there's the whole problem of participation and a whole different mindset or culture. And I say culture deliberately because we've seen a lot of change in the economic world and the world of business. And these changes are starting to happen and will occur. But there is a problem with a divided mindset or culture. Sustainability, which might be truly environmental and social and economic. Of course, companies need to make profits, but they must also guarantee those profits over time. Sometimes you can just look to the short-term gain, but it won't last, because then the bubble bursts. So the compatibility of these four parts, these four circles rather than triangles, is very important. And of course we need citizens to get behind this. Maris is right when he says in Europe there is public support for this Sustainable Development Goals, but that support comes from one part of the population who understand the problems and who go along with the SDGs, and I'm not sure if it's true of the whole general public, and that's where we need to change mindsets. And I think in your meetings you need to bring in the Commissioner for Culture, because it's a new culture that we need to build. And that's why Europe could have different economic models, but we need to bring in culture with the other three circles that we talked about. Thank you very much. It's been fascinating. And thank you to everybody who's come along to help us to talk about all this.
Okay. I think Mercedes did a beautiful summing up there, so I won't do it. Just before everyone disappears, you need to know where the cocktails are. So Guido, could you please stand up and tell everybody where they are in case we get lost?
Je voulais dire dans une des langues européennes.